Before we begin tonight, a thank you to Dermatographia. This episode exists because of you, and if you are listening on Spotify right now, please take 10 seconds and leave a review. A review on Spotify helps this channel reach more people who are lying awake at night searching for something exactly like this. It costs you nothing and means everything to us. Now, dim the lights. Let's begin. Christmas night, Boulder, Colorado, December the 25th, 1996. There is something about Boulder, Colorado in the deep of December that feels designed for stillness. The flatirons, those ancient tilted slabs of red sandstone, disappear into cloud and low sky. Snow sits in the creases of driveways and along fence lines like something the wind forgot to carry away. Porch lights glow amber. Smoke rises from chimneys. The whole city breathes in the slow, contented rhythm of a holiday nearly finished. On the 15th of December in that year, a Christmas party had taken place at the home of the Fleet and Priscilla White family, close friends of the Ramseys. The children played, the adults talked, and somewhere in those hours, 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey moved through the rooms of someone else's house, the way only a child can, with complete and sovereign ease, unaware of time, unaware of consequence, unaware of the future bearing down on her like something already written. She was 6 years old. She had her mother's eyes and her father's determination, and she had already, in the small and spectacular way of children, figured out how to hold a room. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was born on August the 6th, 1990. She was the youngest child of JonBenét Ramsey, a successful businessman and CEO of Access Graphics, a computer hardware company in Boulder that had recently exceeded $1 billion in annual revenue, and Patricia Ann Ramsey, known to everyone as Patsy, a former Miss West Virginia and a woman of fierce devotion to her family, her faith, and her community. By the evening of December the 25th, 1996, the Ramsey family had returned home from a Christmas gathering at the home of another family friend. The details of that evening are documented, reconstructed, and disputed, as nearly every detail of this case would come to be. What is known is this: the children were put to bed. John and Patsy Ramsey retired for the night. The house on 15th Street in the University Hill neighbourhood of Boulder settled into its customary quiet. What happened inside those walls between the hours of 10 o'clock on Christmas night and the early morning of December the 26th will be one of the most analysed, debated and unresolved questions in the history of American criminal investigation. Because by the time the sun rose on the day after Christmas, JonBenét Ramsey was gone. Act 2, December 26th, the morning the node appeared, Patsy. Ramsey woke early on the morning of December the 26th. The account she gave to investigators, an account she would give many times in many rooms across many years, was that she rose before the rest of the family, came downstairs, and found, on the back staircase leading down from the upper floors, a handwritten note, 3 pages long, written on paper from inside the house, demanding $118,000, signed, in language that now feels almost surreal in its theatricality, by a small foreign faction. $118,000. The figure matters. John Ramsey had recently received a bonus from Access Graphics of precisely that amount. The odds of a random kidnapper knowing that specific number, and choosing it, of all figures as the demand, are the kind of odds that investigators tend to notice. That detail would haunt the early investigation the way certain details do, quietly, persistently, without resolution. Patsy called 911 at 5:52 in the morning. The recording of that call exists. Investigators would spend years analysing it. The pauses, the words, the moments where something seemed slightly off, and the moments where nothing did. She sounded afraid. Whether the fear was the fear of a mother whose child had been taken, or something else entirely, became one of the central and ultimately unanswerable questions of the case. Officers from the Boulder Police Department arrived within minutes, and here, in the very first hour of what should have been a precisely controlled investigation, the first of many procedural failures took root. The house was not secured, not in the way a potential crime scene of this magnitude should have been secured. Friends of the family arrived throughout the morning. Neighbours came and went. People moved through the rooms. Every footstep, every touched surface, every shifted object represented potential evidence lost. The Boulder Police Department was a relatively small force, experienced in the kind of crimes that a college town in Colorado typically generates. Not in the protocols of a high-profile kidnapping case that would eventually involve federal agencies, national media, and forensic experts from across the country. The ransom note was bagged and preserved. JonBenét's bedroom was examined. Investigators began the slow and painstaking work of processing a scene that was, even at that early hour, already compromised. And then, hours later, John Ramsey went back down to the basement. Act 3. The Discovery. A basement, a door, a truth. No one was ready, for the basement of the Ramsey home was a series of connected rooms, a wine cellar, a boiler room, a train room where Burke Ramsey's model trains were kept, and a small windowless room that had, at some point, served as a storage space. Its door had a wooden latch that could be fastened from the outside at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon on December the 26th. John Ramsey and his friend Fleet White went downstairs at the suggestion of investigators who wanted someone to check whether anything appeared disturbed or out of place. Fleet White later reported that he had briefly checked the small windowless room earlier that morning and seen nothing. John Ramsey opened the door. Inside, covered by a white blanket, was his daughter. JonBenét Ramsey was dead. She had been strangled. She had suffered a severe blow to the head. Her wrists were bound above her. There was a piece of cord around her neck, a garrote, that investigators would later determine had been fashioned from a brush handle found elsewhere in the home. John Ramsey carried his daughter's body up the stairs. He placed her on the floor of the living room, and in that single act, however instinctive, however human, however understandable from the perspective of a father who had just found his child, the integrity of the crime scene below was further compromised. The body had been moved. The blanket had been moved. The physical arrangement of the evidence in that room had changed. The police were called back in. The investigation that had begun as a kidnapping was now, officially, a homicide. And the questions began to multiply faster than anyone could manage them. Why was JonBenét still in the house? If this had been a real kidnapping, if the note was real, if the small foreign faction was real, why had the kidnappers not taken her? The note demanded money in exchange for a child who, it turned out, was already dead in the basement 12 hours before that note was even read aloud. The staging made no sense under the logic of a conventional abduction. Why had the ransom note demanded a figure that corresponded almost exactly to John Ramsey's bonus? How had an outside intruder known that number? Why was there no clear evidence of forced entry? And if the killer had come from outside the home, how had they entered? What had they done? And how had they left without being seen, heard, or detected by the family sleeping above? In a case with this much evidence, this many investigators, and this many years, it is not just what was found that matters, it is what was never fully explained. Act 4. The Ransom Note. 3 pages and 100 unanswered questions. The ransom note found on the back staircase of the Ramsey home on December the 26th, 1996 is, by any measure, one of the most studied documents in the history of American true crime. Forensic linguists, handwriting experts, psychologists and investigators have pored over its 3 pages for nearly 3 decades. And what they have found, or rather, what they have repeatedly failed to definitively conclude, speaks to the fundamental strangeness of the document itself. Let us begin with what is known. The note was written on paper from a notepad, found inside the Ramsey home. The pen used to write it, or at least a pen consistent with the ink in the note, was found inside the home as well. This means that whoever wrote the note had access to the home, and had written it there, not brought it from outside. The implication of that fact is significant. Either a member of the household wrote it, or an intruder had entered the home, found paper and pen, sat down, and composed a 3-page document in relative calm, presumably while the family slept upstairs. The length alone is remarkable. Ransom notes, in documented cases of actual kidnapping, tend to be brief, specific, functional. They communicate a demand, a threat, and a set of instructions. They are not literary exercises. The note left in the Ramsey home ran to approximately 3 pages and contained passages that felt less like the work of a criminal and more like the work of someone trying to perform criminality, someone who had absorbed the cadence of thrillers and procedural dramas and was, consciously or not, writing in that register. There are references to Your Country and to John Ramsey specifically being a fat cat. There are specific instructions about not involving the FBI, instructions that seem almost designed to be noticed and analysed, as if the writer understood that every word would eventually be scrutinised. There are passages of what can only be described as theatrical menace, alternating with moments of oddly formal language, as if the register of the document could not quite decide what it was. Handwriting analysts were brought in. Multiple experts examined the note in the weeks and months following the murder. Some identified similarities between the handwriting in the note and samples of Patsy Ramsey's handwriting. Others disagreed. The handwriting evidence was never conclusive in either direction. Patsy Ramsey submitted to multiple handwriting comparisons throughout the investigation. She was neither definitively implicated nor definitively cleared by the analysis. The linguistic content of the note was also examined for what forensic linguists call idiolect, the unique patterns of vocabulary, syntax and phrasing that characterize any individual's use of language. Certain phrases in the note were flagged as potentially consistent with Patsy Ramsey's documented speech patterns. Others were not. The field of forensic linguistics is not a precise science, and the conclusions drawn from it in this case reflected that imprecision. What the note did accomplish, whatever its origin, was to immediately establish a narrative. Someone wanted investigators and media to believe that an outside party had entered the home, abducted JonBenét, and was holding her for ransom. That narrative shaped the first hours of the investigation. It shaped the first days. And even after JonBenét's body was found in the basement, even after the internal logic of the note collapsed under the weight of that discovery, the narrative continued to influence how the case was framed, pursued, and presented to the public. Because once a story begins, it is very hard to stop. Act 5. No forced entry. The question of how someone got in any investigation involving a crime committed inside a private residence. One of the first questions investigators ask is simple and foundational. How did the perpetrator enter the home? In the Ramsey case, the answer to that question was never definitively established, and that absence of a clear answer became one of the most contested elements of the entire investigation. The house on 15th Street was a large Victorian home. 3 floors, multiple rooms, numerous windows, and several exterior doors. Investigators examined the home systematically. What they found, or rather what they largely failed to find, was evidence of forced entry. The doors were, by most accounts, locked or at least secured. The windows on the upper floors were not identified as points of entry. The main entryways showed no signs of tampering. There was, however, one exception that became central to the intruder theory: a basement window. The window in question was on the south side of the basement. It had a grate over it on the exterior. Below it, on the interior, was a small suitcase that some investigators believed could have been used as a step, either to exit or to enter through the window. John Ramsey himself acknowledged that he had, at some point in the past, broken this window accidentally and entered through it when he was locked out of the house. The broken latch and the general condition of the window were consistent with having been used as an access point, but also consistent with simply being an old, imperfectly maintained basement window. Here is where the evidence becomes particularly complex. There were reportedly some fibres and a small amount of organic debris in or around the window well that could have been consistent with someone passing through. There was also a scuff mark on the wall below the window on the interior, potentially consistent with someone climbing through and bracing themselves against the wall. But the evidence was inconclusive. No definitive proof of entry through that window was ever established. For investigators pursuing the intruder theory, this window was everything. It was the mechanism, the explanation, the answer to how someone from outside had entered the home without being seen or heard. For investigators skeptical of the intruder theory, the window was a distraction, a feature of the home that had been identified as a possible access point without any concrete evidence that it had actually been used on the night in question. The question of forced entry, or the absence thereof, remains one of the foundational ambiguities of the case, and it is an ambiguity that, depending on which theory you favour, leads you to entirely different conclusions about everything that followed. Act 6. The DNA. A thread that changed everything, and nothing of all the evidence collected in the JonBenét Ramsey investigation, none has been more consequential and more persistently ambiguous than the DNA found on her clothing. In the weeks following the murder, forensic investigators processed the clothing JonBenét had been wearing when her body was found. On her underwear, they identified a small amount of genetic material, DNA, that did not match any member of the Ramsey family and did not match any individual in the known investigative pool. It was, in the formal language of forensic science, unidentified male DNA. This finding became the cornerstone of the intruder theory. If an unidentified person's DNA was present on JonBenét's clothing, on the most intimate, proximate evidence of the crime, then surely that person had been in contact with her. Surely that DNA was evidence of the presence of the killer. Surely this was the proof that an outsider had done this. For years, that argument was powerful. It gave investigators and family supporters a foundation on which to build the case for an unknown intruder. And it kept the Ramsey family from being formally charged, at least in part because prosecutors were unwilling to take a case to trial when such significant unidentified DNA existed. But the counter-argument was also powerful. The DNA was small in quantity. It was found in a location, the underwear, that raised the question of contamination or innocent transfer. The underwear JonBenét was wearing on the night she died was, according to some accounts, not the pair she had been wearing earlier in the evening. It was a new pair from a package that may have contained DNA from manufacturing or handling. The argument that the DNA came from an innocent source, a factory worker, a store employee, anyone who had handled the garment, before it was purchased, could not be dismissed. In 2008, more than a decade after the murder, the Boulder District Attorney's Office made a dramatic announcement. Using advances in DNA technology, investigators had developed a more complete profile of the unknown male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing. They compared it to the Ramsey family. It did not match. And based on this finding, based on the DNA evidence as it then stood, the district attorney issued a formal statement declaring that the Ramsey family was cleared of suspicion. Patsy Ramsey had died of ovarian cancer 2 years earlier, in 2006. She never received that formal statement in her lifetime, but the DNA, as exculpatory as its interpretation had become, still had no name attached to it. The profile existed in national databases. It had been compared against known offenders, against individuals connected to the case, against anyone investigators could reasonably test. No match was found. The DNA remained, and remains today, unidentified. Is it the DNA of JonBenét's killer? Is it incidental contamination? Is it something in between? The trace of a person who was present, but whose role in the crime is more complicated than the simple perpetrator? No one knows, and the not knowing is part of what makes this case so enduringly haunting. Act 7. The Media and the Machine. How a tragedy became a spectacle. In the days immediately following JonBenét's murder, the story entered the American media ecosystem and began to transform. What had been a local tragedy, a child found dead in her family's home on the day after Christmas, became something else entirely, a national obsession, a cultural phenomenon, and a mirror in which a country examined itself and found, in the reflection, things it was not entirely comfortable seeing. JonBenét had competed in child beauty pageants. This fact, innocuous in the world of competitive pageantry, a world with its own conventions and communities and points of pride, became, in the hands of national media, the most sensationalized element of the story. Images of JonBenét in pageant makeup, in elaborate costumes, performing routines on tiny stages, were broadcast repeatedly. They were analysed, debated, and deployed to tell a story about the family and about a certain kind of American ambition that may or may not have had anything to do with what happened in that basement. The framing mattered. It shaped how viewers understood the family. It shaped how investigators were perceived. It shaped the contours of the public's investment in the case, which was, from very early on, enormous. The JonBenét Ramsey case was not simply a murder investigation. It was a story. And like all stories, it had characters and arcs, and a hunger for resolution that the evidence stubbornly refused to satisfy. John and Patsy Ramsey were, from the beginning, cast in the role of primary suspects by a significant portion of the media. This casting occurred before any formal finding by investigators. It occurred before the forensic evidence had been fully analysed. It occurred in the space between fact and narrative, in the gap where speculation becomes, through repetition and emphasis, something that feels like knowledge. The Ramseys were subjected to a level of public scrutiny that is difficult to overstate. Their statements were passed. Their body language was analysed by commentators with no formal training in behavioural analysis. Their choice of attorney, a natural and legally advisable step for anyone in their position, was treated as evidence of guilt. The dynamics of their marriage and family life were examined and re-examined by people who had never met them. Meanwhile, the actual investigation, the forensic work, the witness interviews, the evidence processing, was occurring in a far less visible space, often undermined by the very publicity that surrounded it. Potential witnesses were difficult to approach without the media following. The integrity of the investigative process was repeatedly compromised by leaks, by coverage, and by the sheer cultural weight of a case that had become too big to be managed quietly. The media did not solve the JonBenét Ramsey case. In many ways, the media made solving it harder, and the question of whether that outcome was accidental, institutional, or something more deliberate is a question worth sitting with. Act 8. The Grand Jury, a decision that was made and then unmade. In 1998, nearly 2 years after JonBenét's murder, a grand jury was convened in Boulder County to hear evidence in the case. Grand juries in the American legal system operate in secret. Their deliberations are sealed. Their findings are not automatically public. They are in many ways designed to be invisible, a mechanism through which a body of citizens reviews evidence and decides whether there is sufficient cause to bring formal charges. The grand jury in the JonBenét Ramsey case heard evidence for 13 months. It was one of the longest grand jury proceedings in Colorado history. At the end of those 13 months, in October of 1999, the jury made a decision. For nearly 15 years, that decision was officially secret. But in 2013, following a legal challenge by news organisations, the documents were partially unsealed, and what they revealed was significant. The grand jury had voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey on charges related to child abuse, resulting in death, and on charges of being accessories after the fact. But here is the crucial, extraordinary and still debated element of what happened next. The district attorney at the time, Alex Hunter, chose not to pursue the indictment. He made the determination, publicly framed as a matter of insufficient evidence, that the case did not meet the standard required for prosecution. The indictment that the grand jury had voted in favour of was, in effect, set aside. No charges were filed. The legal questions surrounding this decision are significant. A district attorney has the authority, under Colorado law, to decline to pursue an indictment even when a grand jury votes in favour of one. This is not a violation of law, but it is an unusual exercise of prosecutorial discretion, particularly in a case of this magnitude, in which the evidence had been before a grand jury for over a year. Alex Hunter has maintained, over the years since, that the evidence was simply not sufficient to meet the burden of proof required for a criminal conviction. His critics have argued that he was too cautious, too deferential, and that the decision not to pursue the indictment was a failure of justice. His defenders have argued that taking an insufficient case to trial would have been a far greater injustice, one that could have resulted in the wrongful conviction of innocent people, or in the permanent closing of a case that still had unresolved questions. Both positions contain truth. Both positions leave something important unresolved, and the decision of 1999, the decision to indict and then to not indict, became one more layer of ambiguity in a case that had, from the very beginning, seemed almost to resist clarity. Act 9. John Mark Carr and the Confession That Collapsed. In the summer of 2006, a schoolteacher named John Mark Carr, who was at the time living in Thailand, contacted a University of Colorado journalism professor named Michael Tracy and, in a series of emails, described in disturbing detail his alleged involvement in JonBenét Ramsey's death. Carr claimed he had been present in the Ramsey home. He claimed he had killed her. He provided specific details that investigators found worth pursuing. The story broke publicly in August of 2006. The reaction was immediate and enormous. Carr was apprehended in Thailand. He was extradited to the United States. He gave a press conference at an airport, calm, odd, eerily composed, in which he stated that he had been with JonBenét when she died, and that her death had been an accident. For approximately 2 weeks, it appeared that the JonBenét Ramsey case might finally be resolved, that a decade of mystery and ambiguity might have a name, a face and a story attached to it, that the long silence might be broken. And then the DNA results came back. John Mark Carr's DNA did not match the unidentified male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing. The physical evidence did not support his confession. His account of his whereabouts on the night of December the 25th, 1996, was investigated and found to be inconsistent with evidence placing him elsewhere. His teacher's records from California, where he had been living at the time, were examined. The charges were dropped. John Mark Carr, who had confessed in apparent detail to one of the most notorious murders in American history, had not committed it. Or at least, the available evidence did not support the conclusion that he had. He was, in the formal language of the legal system, released. The episode left investigators, journalists and the public shaken. Not because a false confession was unheard of. False confessions occur with disturbing regularity in the American legal system, but because this one had been so specific, so detailed, and so publicly credible. It raised the question of what Carr had actually known, and how he had known it. It raised the question of who had told him what, and why. And it added one more impossible layer to a case that was already almost impossibly complex. Act 10. The Investigative Journalist, Daniel Harlow and the Redirection Theory. Years after the events of December 1996, a journalist, we will call him Daniel Harlow, returned to the Ramsey case with a different kind of attention. Not the frantic, competitive attention of 1997 and 1998, when every television network had a correspondent assigned to Boulder, and every tabloid had a theory. A quieter attention. The kind that comes from reading everything, sitting with it, and noticing the things that had been passed over. Harlow was not the first person to look closely at the procedural failures of the early investigation. He was not the first to note the strangeness of the ransom note, or the questions surrounding the grand jury, or the peculiar weight of the unidentified DNA. Those observations had been made before, by investigators, by authors, by documentary filmmakers, by the Ramseys themselves, and by their critics. What Harlow brought was a specific analytical framework. He was not interested primarily in who had killed JonBenét Ramsey. He was interested in something slightly different and in some ways more disturbing. The question of whether the investigation itself had been redirected. Not through any single act of corruption or malice, but through a series of decisions, some inadvertent, some institutional, some possibly deliberate, that had, collectively, pushed the case away from certain lines of inquiry and toward others. Harlow's thesis, as he developed it over the course of his investigation, was this. In the first hours and days of the JonBenét Ramsey case, the investigative process was so compromised by procedural failures, by the contamination of the crime scene, by the competing pressures of media attention and political caution, that a coherent singular theory of the crime was never properly established. And in the absence of that coherent theory, what filled the void was narrative. The story of what had happened was constructed not from evidence alone, but from the intersection of evidence with assumption, pressure, and the need to make sense of something that, at its core, resisted sense. Once a narrative is established in a high-profile case, Harlow argued, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to dislodge, not because the evidence necessarily supports it, but because the institutional and cultural weight behind it accumulates. Investigators who committed to one theory are reluctant to abandon it. Media organisations that have shaped public understanding in a particular direction are reluctant to revise that understanding. Prosecutors who have made public statements are constrained by those statements, and so the case moves forward, or fails to move forward, within the grooves that were laid down in the beginning. Harlow identified what he called the moment of fork, a point in the early investigation when two distinct theories of the crime were genuinely alive, each with some evidentiary support, and when a decision, not necessarily conscious or corrupt, but real nonetheless, was made to pursue one more aggressively than the other. From that point forward, he argued, the investigation was shaped by that choice. Evidence consistent with the less pursued theory was not necessarily suppressed, but it was not developed with the same resources, the same urgency, or the same analytical rigour. The redirection, in Harlow's framework, was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was not a smoky room of powerful people deciding what the truth would be. It was something quieter and more systemic, the ordinary institutional process by which complex investigations get simplified, narratives get solidified, and the full range of possibility gets narrowed to something manageable, even if what gets managed is not, in the end, the truth. Act 11. The Unknown Visitor, a figure at the edge of the timeline. In his examination of the case, Harlow focused particular attention on what he called the threshold hours, the period between approximately 9 o'clock on the evening of December the 25th and the moment Patsy Ramsey made her 911 call at 5:52 on the morning of December the 26th. Roughly 9 hours during which the last events of JonBenét Ramsey's life occurred, and during which the truth of what happened in that house on 15th Street was either witnessed, concealed, or permanently lost. The Ramsey family's account of those hours was consistent. The children were put to bed, the adults retired, nothing unusual occurred until the following morning. This account was given multiple times, examined by multiple investigators, and subjected to extensive scrutiny. It was neither definitively corroborated nor definitively contradicted. Harlow's focus, however, was not on the family's account itself. It was on the gaps in the investigative record around that account. Specifically, he identified several individuals who were known to the Ramsey family, people who would have had some familiarity with the house, some knowledge of the family's routines, some potential access, whose movements on Christmas night and the early hours of December the 26th were not, in Harlow's assessment, as thoroughly documented as the investigation required. He was careful, in his written work, not to name these individuals. His argument was not that any specific person was guilty. His argument was structural, that the investigation had identified a pool of potential witnesses and persons of interest in the first days, and that not all of them had been pursued with equal rigour, that some threads had been followed to their conclusion, and others had been followed only part way, and then, for reasons that may or may not have been investigative, allowed to drop. One figure in particular occupied Harlow's attention, an individual whom he described as someone who was known to the family, who had been in proximity to the family in the days before the murder, and whose subsequent movements and communications in the period following the murder raised, in his view, questions that had never been adequately explored. Harlow did not have definitive evidence linking this person to the crime. What he had was a pattern of gaps, places where the investigative record was thinner than the situation warranted, questions that had been asked once but not followed up on, statements that had been taken at face value when a more rigorous examination might have found inconsistencies. In the architecture of conspiracy theories, there is always a figure at the edge, someone just beyond the light, whose presence explains what the centre of the picture cannot. The risk of this kind of analysis is real. It can be a method of finding what you're looking for, regardless of what the evidence actually shows. The human mind is extraordinarily skilled at finding patterns and at constructing narratives. Around them, Even when the patterns are coincidental and the narratives are false, Harlow was aware of this risk. He acknowledged it explicitly, and yet, he argued, there is also a risk in the opposite direction. The risk of a closed investigation, of a case so thoroughly managed and so publicly defined that new lines of inquiry cannot gain traction. The risk of institutional inertia masquerading as thoroughness. The risk of mistaking the absence of a clear answer for proof that the right questions have been asked. Act 12. Why redirect? The mechanics of institutional silence. If we accept, and it is worth being clear that accepting this is itself a significant step, if we accept Harlow's framework and consider the possibility that the JonBenét Ramsey investigation was, at some point and in some form, redirected, then a natural question follows. Why? The simplest and most cynical answer is self-protection. The Boulder Police Department's earlies. Handling of the crime scene was, by the standards of professional forensic investigation, poor. Evidence was contaminated. Procedures were not followed. The home was not secured. These are not small failures in the investigation of a homicide. They are the kind of failures that, in a high-profile case, become targets of scrutiny and liability. If the early investigation had been conducted poorly enough that the truth was effectively rendered inaccessible, there would have been institutional incentive, not necessarily conscious, not necessarily coordinated, to avoid having that fact become the dominant narrative of the case. A second possibility is the kind of social and community protection that operates in wealthy, tight-knit communities. Boulder in 1996 was, and in many ways remains, a particular kind of place. Educated, progressive, affluent, insular. The Ramseys were not native to Boulder. They had moved there when Access Graphics relocated, but they had become part of its upper professional social world. Their circle included people of influence, people with connections, people whose lives would have been significantly affected by certain kinds of scrutiny. Harlow's theory does not require that anyone in this circle committed a crime or conspired to protect one. It requires only that the natural social dynamics of a community, the reluctance to believe that someone you know could be involved in something this terrible, the discomfort with aggressive investigation of people whose lives resemble your own, might have contributed to a softer, more protective approach in some areas of the investigation. A third possibility is simpler still, the compounding effect of early error. In the immediate aftermath of a crime, investigators make decisions under conditions of uncertainty, time pressure, and incomplete information. Some of those decisions turn out to be right, some turn out to be wrong, and when a decision that turns out to be wrong has already been made public, when investigators have already told reporters one thing, when the department has already moved resources in a particular direction, the cost of reversing that decision can seem prohibitive, not because the truth doesn't matter, but because the institutional cost of admitting a significant mistake is high enough that the path of least resistance is to continue in the established direction and hope the evidence eventually catches up. None of these possibilities require a smoking gun. None of them require a room full of people explicitly deciding to hide the truth. What they require is something far more ordinary, and in some ways, far more disturbing. The ordinary human tendency to protect, to simplify, to maintain, and to avoid the pain of correction. Applied at scale, in a case of this size and this visibility, that ordinary tendency can produce outcomes that look, in retrospect, like something more deliberate than they were, or, and this is the possibility that keeps serious investigators up at night, they were more deliberate. Not across the board, not in every dimension of the investigation, but in specific moments, specific decisions, specific choices about which threads to follow and which to let go. In which case the silence around those moments is not accidental, it is managed, and the management of silence is its own kind of act. Act 13. The evidence that remains, what the record actually shows. It is important, in a case like this, a case that has accumulated decades of theory, speculation and narrative, to return, periodically, to what the physical record actually contains. Because the physical record is not nothing. It is considerable, and it tells a story even if that story is incomplete. JonBenét Ramsey died from asphyxia due to strangulation, associated with craniocerebral trauma. The medical examiner determined that she had suffered a significant blow to the head, a blow severe enough to fracture her skull, and that she had been strangled with a garrote fashioned from a paintbrush handle found in the home and a length of cord. The sequence of the injuries and their precise timing in relation to each other was a matter of forensic debate. What was not debated was that they were deliberately inflicted. The garrote itself was significant. Its construction, cord tied around a broken paintbrush handle, required some degree of technical knowledge or deliberate improvisation. The materials used were from inside the home. The cord was consistent with cord found elsewhere in the house. The paintbrush handle was from a set belonging to Patsy Ramsey, the pineapple. There's a detail in this case that is, in the context of everything else, almost unbearably small, and yet it matters. A bowl of pineapple was found on the kitchen table of the Ramsey home on the morning of December the 26th. In the autopsy of JonBenét's body, undigested pineapple was found in her digestive system, material consistent with having been consumed within the hour or two before her death. The pineapple in the bowl had fingerprints on it from Burke Ramsey and Patsy Ramsey. JonBenét's fingerprints were not on the bowl. This raises a question that investigators and analysts have never definitively answered. Who gave JonBenét pineapple in the late hours of December the 25th? And under what circumstances was she still awake and eating? The duct tape found at the scene, which had been applied to JonBenét's mouth, left a residue and possibly fibres. The cord around her wrists, the white blanket covering her body, the specific arrangement of her clothing. All of these elements of the physical scene were documented, photographed, analysed. None of them, individually or collectively, produced a definitive answer about the identity of the person who had placed them there. The unidentified male DNA, as discussed, previously remains in the record. It has not gone away. It has been retested, reanalysed, compared against expanding databases. As of the most recent public reporting, it has not been matched to any identified individual, and the ransom note, the 3 pages, the $118,000, the foreign faction, it sits in an evidence archive somewhere in Colorado, analysed, reanalysed, linguistically profiled, handwriting compared, and still ultimately unanswered. Who sat in that house and wrote those words? What was in their mind as they wrote them? Were they writing the truth of their intentions, or were they writing a fiction designed to mislead? Were they writing from guilt, from fear, from calculation, from desperation? No one knows, and that not knowing, after 29 years, is the central fact of this case. Act 14, Burke Ramsey. The brother, the silence, and the years between. Burke Ramsey was 9 years old on the night his sister died. He was by all accounts asleep in his room. He was interviewed by investigators, first informally, then more formally, then through child advocacy channels designed to minimise trauma in interviews with young witnesses. His accounts of the night were, as is common and expected with child witnesses, limited in their detail and somewhat variable across interviews. For most of the decades following his sister's murder, Burke Ramsey stayed largely out of the public eye. He grew up, went to college, entered a profession. He was, in the most fundamental sense, someone who had experienced an extraordinary trauma at the most vulnerable age and had built a life afterward. But the scrutiny never fully released him. A small but persistent subset of investigators and theorists maintained that Burke Ramsey's role in the events of December the 25th and 26th required more examination than it had received. Some pointed to the pineapple, to the fingerprints on the bowl, and to the question of who had shared that late-night snack with JonBenét. Some pointed to accounts of the siblings' relationship that described, as sibling relationships often do, moments of conflict and tension. Some pointed to what they characterised as inconsistencies in Burke's interviews. In 2016, Burke Ramsey appeared in a CBS documentary about the case. Investigators on the documentary concluded that Burke was the most likely perpetrator. Burke responded with a defamation lawsuit against CBS and against those investigators. The lawsuit was settled. No admission of wrongdoing was made by either party, and no findings of fact about Burke Ramsey's involvement, or lack of involvement, were established through the legal proceedings. What is fair to say is this: Burke Ramsey was a 9-year-old child on the night his sister died. He lost her. He grew up in the shadow of an unsolved murder and a public narrative that circled his family for decades. Whatever the truth of what happened in that house, Burke Ramsey has lived with its aftermath in ways that most people will never be asked to live with anything. That is a fact worth holding alongside all the theories. Act 15. The case today. 29 years of unanswered questions. The JonBenét Ramsey case remains officially open. The Boulder Police Department has, over the decades, assigned and reassigned the case to cold case units and specific detectives. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation has been involved at various points. The FBI has consulted. Private investigators have been retained by the family. Authors, documentarians, journalists, and researchers have produced an enormous body of work examining the evidence from every conceivable angle. And yet, as of the time of this episode, no one has been charged. No one has been convicted. No one has been identified with any degree of certainty as the person who killed JonBenét Ramsey on the night of December the 25th, 1996. In recent years, advances in forensic DNA technology have kept the possibility of resolution alive. Investigative genetic genealogy, the technique used to identify the Golden State Killer and other long-cold perpetrators, has been applied or considered for application to the Ramsey case. The approach involves building family trees from partial DNA profiles, working backward from distant relatives to identify potential suspects. It is not a quick process, and it is not always conclusive. But it has, in other cases, broken open decades of silence. Whether it will do so here remains to be seen. The Boulder Police Department has not made a public announcement of any new suspect. The unidentified DNA profile, the evidence that cleared the Ramsey family in 2008, has not been publicly matched to any living individual. The case file has grown to an enormous size. The number of individuals who have been interviewed, tested and cleared is substantial, and somewhere in that file, in the thousands of pages of investigative notes, forensic reports, witness statements and analytical memos, the truth may exist, waiting, or it may not. Cases go cold for reasons that are sometimes circumstantial, sometimes institutional, and sometimes simply a matter of probability. Not every crime leaves enough evidence to be solved, and the failures of the early investigation may have foreclosed possibilities that cannot now be recovered. The truth of what happened to JonBenét Ramsey may be something that the available record can no longer definitively establish, not because no one knows it, but because the chain of evidence that would have established it was broken, accidentally or otherwise, in the first hours of December the 26th, 1996. Epilogue. The Boulder. Silence. What remains? There is a particular kind of silence that settles over unsolved cases. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of weight, of something heavy being held in place, of questions that have been asked so many times they have worn grooves into the air around them, of answers that may exist somewhere but have not, in all the years since, been spoken aloud in the right room, at the right time, in the right form. JonBenét Ramsey was 6 years old. She was a child, bright and full of life, with her whole future organised in front of her by the people who loved her. She wore elaborate costumes on small stages and won trophies, and came home to a house in Boulder, Colorado, where a family was doing its best, as families do, to build something good and lasting. She did not choose the circumstances of her death, or the decades of public analysis that followed it, or the ways in which her image has been used and interpreted and argued over by people who never knew her. What she left behind, beyond the grief of those who loved her, is a case, a set of evidence, a file, a question, and the question has not been answered. Harlow's theory, the theory that the investigation was, at some point and in some form, redirected, is not provable in the way that a court would require. It is a structural argument, a pattern-based argument, an argument about the shape of what was not done as much as what was. It may be wrong. The investigation may have been conducted as thoroughly and as honestly as the circumstances allowed, and the absence of a resolution may be simply the result of a case in which the truth was always going to be difficult to establish. But the questions remain. They have always remained. They are the kind of questions that don't go away, not because of conspiracy, not because of deliberate concealment, but because they are real questions, grounded in real evidence, pointing toward real gaps in the record that have never been filled. Who wrote the ransom note? Who was in that house on Christmas night? Whose DNA is on those clothes? What happened in the basement of 15 7th Street on the night of December the 25th, 1996? The evidence exists, the timeline exists, the file exists, the questions exist, and somewhere, in a database, in a file cabinet, in the memory of someone who has carried a fragment of this truth for 29 years, the answer may exist too, waiting, as it has always been waiting, for the moment when the silence finally breaks. Before we dive into today's story, I want to take just a moment to ask for your support. If you're enjoying this content, using your hype points on this video helps the channel more than you possibly know. It truly makes a difference in reaching new listeners and keeping these stories coming. If you're tuning in on Spotify, leaving a review helps out so much as well. And if you want, drop a comment telling us what time it is and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It reminds us that these stories connect people across continents and time zones. And of course, if you enjoy the content, subscribing means we can keep bringing you these deep dives into history's darkest corners. Now, let's get into it. Imagine waking up on a Sunday morning. The sky is clear. The ocean is calm. You're stationed at one of the most beautiful military installations in the world, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It's December 7th, 1941. For most sailors and soldiers, it's a day of rest. Some are writing letters home, others are eating breakfast in mess halls or preparing for church services. The ships sit in neat rows along Battleship Row, their steel hulls gleaming in the early light. Seaman First Class James Miller stands on the deck of the USS Oklahoma, coffee cup in hand, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. He's thinking about his girl back in Kansas. He promised her he'd be home for Christmas next year. The war in Europe feels distant, irrelevant. This is paradise. This is safety. In the galley of the USS Arizona, cooks are preparing breakfast for a crew of 1,500 men. The smell of bacon and coffee fills the air. Men joke and laugh. Someone hums a tune from the radio. Sunday morning, the best morning of the week. At Hickam Field, Army Air Corps personnel sleep in. The hangar doors are open. Rows of fighters and bombers sit parked wing to wing neatly, arranged for easy security. No one expects trouble. No one is on alert. Then, at 7:55 in the morning, the world explodes. The sound comes first. A distant droning that grows louder, closer, until it becomes a roar that shakes the ground. Sailors look up. They see formations of aircraft approaching from the north. Some wave, thinking they're American planes on a training exercise. Then they see the red circles on the wings, the rising sun. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft scream out of the sky. Bombs tear through the decks of battleships. Torpedoes slice through the water and rip open hulls below the waterline. Machine gun fire rakes across airfields, destroying planes before they can even take off. Within 2 hours, more than 2,000 Americans are dead. The Pacific Fleet is crippled, and the United States is suddenly, irrevocably, at war. James Miller never makes it home for Christmas. He drowns in the capsized hull of the Oklahoma, trapped in darkness as the water rises around him, and 500 other men. The cooks on the Arizona never serve that breakfast. The ship explodes with such force that parts of her superstructure are found half a mile away. Most of the crew dies instantly. Those who don't burn. For generations, Pearl Harbor has been remembered as a day of infamy, a surprise attack that pulled America into the Second World War. But underneath the official narrative, a darker question has lingered for more than 80 years. Was Pearl Harbor really a surprise? Or was it a warning that leadership chose not to act on? Some believe the attack could have been prevented. Others go further, suggesting that those in power may have allowed it to happen because they needed it to happen. They needed a catalyst powerful enough to unite a divided nation and justify entry into a global conflict. Tonight, we're going to walk through the intelligence, the warnings, the decisions, and the silences that preceded one of the most devastating days in American history. We'll examine what was known, when it was known, and who knew it. We'll hear from the men who saw the signs and tried to sound the alarm. We'll trace the chain of command from radar stations to the highest levels of government. And by the end, you'll be left with a question that refuses to go away. When a nation is caught off guard, is it because no one saw it coming, or because someone chose not to look? This is the story of the warning that was ignored. Chapter 1. A Nation Divided About War. To understand what happened at Pearl Harbor, you first need to understand the America that existed before December the 7th, 1941. This was not a nation eager for war. In fact, it was a nation desperate to avoid it. The memories of the First World War still lingered like ghosts. Millions of men had been sent overseas to fight in trenches, to die in mud and poison gas, in a conflict many Americans believed had nothing to do with them. Mothers had waved goodbye to sons who never came home. Entire towns had lost their young men to European battlefields that most Americans couldn't find on a map. When the war ended in 1918, the United States retreated inward. Isolationism became the dominant political philosophy. The message was clear. America would stay out of Europe's problems. It would protect its own borders and let the rest of the world solve its own conflicts. The League of Nations, created to prevent future wars, was rejected by the American Senate. The ocean was wide, the homeland was safe. Never again would American blood be spilled in foreign wars. By the late 1930s, Europe was once again descending into chaos. Adolf Hitler had risen to power in Germany, preaching racial supremacy and territorial expansion. Fascism was spreading across Italy under Benito Mussolini. Spain had collapsed into civil war, and in Asia, Japan was carving out an empire through brutal military conquest. And yet, despite the growing darkness, most Americans wanted nothing to do with another foreign war. Polls conducted throughout 1939 and 1940 showed that more than 80% of the population opposed direct involvement in European conflicts. The America First Committee, led by prominent figures including aviator Charles Lindbergh, held massive rallies arguing that intervention would be a disaster. Mothers who had lost sons in the First World War formed groups demanding neutrality. Politicians campaigned on promises to keep American boys out of foreign trenches. The isolationist movement was powerful, vocal, and widespread. It crossed party lines. It united urban intellectuals and rural farmers. It reflected a deep conviction that the problems of other continents were not America's responsibility. But not everyone agreed. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt saw the threat differently. He believed that fascism and militarism were not just Europe's problem, they were humanity's problem. He understood that if the Axis powers were allowed to dominate Europe and Asia, the security of the United States itself would eventually be at risk. He had watched Hitler's rise with growing alarm. He had read reports of atrocities in China. He had met with Winston Churchill and heard first-hand accounts of Britain's desperate struggle for survival. Roosevelt believed that American involvement was not just likely, it was necessary. But Roosevelt also understood that he could not drag a reluctant nation into war. The Constitution gave Congress the power to declare war. Congress would not act without public support, and public opinion was overwhelmingly against intervention. This created a political dilemma that would define the final years before Pearl Harbor. How do you prepare a nation for a war it does not want? Roosevelt began walking a tightrope. Publicly, he reassured Americans that he would keep them out of war. In his 1940 campaign for an unprecedented third term, he promised parents, "Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." The crowds cheered. He won the election. Privately, he worked to support Britain and China through programs like Lend-Lease, supplying weapons and resources without committing troops. The policy was sold as a way to stay out of war by helping others fight in America's place. "We must be the arsenal of democracy," Roosevelt declared in a fireside chat. But critics saw it differently. They argued that Lend-Lease was a backdoor to intervention, that supplying one side in a war meant taking sides, and that taking sides meant eventual involvement. Roosevelt strengthened the military. He expanded intelligence operations. He positioned naval forces in strategic locations. He did everything he could to prepare the United States for the conflict he believed was inevitable. But he could not declare war without Congress. And Congress would not declare war without public support. And public support would not materialize unless something changed. Something dramatic. Something personal. Something that made the threat undeniable. In the White House, conversations took place behind closed doors. Advisors debated strategy. Intelligence officials briefed the president on global developments. And the question hung in the air, unspoken but understood. What would it take to change the public's mind? This is where the conspiracy theory begins. Some historians and researchers believe that Roosevelt, and others in his administration, recognized that only a direct attack on American soil would be enough to unite the country. They suggest that Pearl Harbor was not simply a failure of intelligence or preparedness. They suggest it was an event that certain leaders were willing to allow, because the alternative, remaining neutral while the world burned, was worse. To be clear, this is not proven. There is no document where Roosevelt writes, "Let them attack." There is no recording of a cabinet meeting where the decision is made. The evidence is circumstantial, built on patterns of behaviour, intelligence that was not acted upon, and outcomes that aligned perfectly with strategic needs. But the question persists because the political context makes it plausible. When a leader is trapped between what they believe must be done and what the public will accept, how far might they go to bridge that gap? Would Roosevelt have risked American lives to save more lives in the long run? Would he have allowed a tragedy to prevent a greater one? These are not comfortable questions, but they are the questions that the Pearl Harbor conspiracy theory forces us to confront. By late 1941, Roosevelt and his advisors knew that war with Japan was likely. Tensions had been escalating for years. Economic pressure was mounting. Diplomatic relations were deteriorating. The question was not whether conflict would come, but when and how. And in that space between inevitability and action, some believe a decision was made, not to start a war, but to let one start. In the halls of power, the calculations were cold. 2,000 lives versus 200,000. A crippled fleet versus a united nation. Short-term catastrophe versus long-term survival. If the conspiracy theory is true, then Pearl Harbor was not an attack that caught America by surprise. It was an attack that America allowed to happen. And the men who died that morning were not victims of Japanese aggression alone. They were sacrifices on the altar of strategy. Chapter 2: Rising Tensions with Japan. Japan in the 1930s was a nation transformed by ambition and desperation. After centuries of isolation, Japan had rapidly industrialized and modernized. It had built a powerful military, it had developed an empire, but it also faced a critical problem that would drive its actions for the next decade: resources. Japan is a small island nation with limited natural resources. It has little oil, limited steel, almost no rubber. To sustain its military and its growing population, it needed raw materials that it did not have, and the only way to get them was to take them from somewhere else. The solution, in the eyes of Japanese leadership, was expansion. Throughout the 1930s, Japan invaded and occupied large portions of China. The conquest was brutal. Cities were destroyed. Civilians were massacred. The world watched in horror as reports emerged from places like Nanking, where Japanese soldiers committed atrocities that shocked even hardened diplomats. Japan established puppet governments in occupied territories. It seized control of regions rich in resources. It justified its actions with rhetoric about creating a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a bloc of Asian nations free from Western colonialism, led by Japan. The League of Nations condemned these actions. So did the United States. But condemnation without enforcement meant nothing. Japan continued its expansion unchecked, confident that the Western powers were too distracted by their own problems to intervene. Then the United States intervened, not with troops, but with economics. In 1940, the Roosevelt administration imposed a series of trade restrictions on Japan. First, it was steel and scrap metal, materials essential for building warships and aircraft. Then aviation fuel. Japan could no longer rely on American suppliers to fuel its military machine. The restrictions tightened throughout 1941. In the summer, the United States froze all Japanese assets held in American banks. This was followed by a full oil embargo, the most devastating blow of all. Japan imported more than 80% of its oil from the United States and its allies. Without oil, the Japanese military could not function. Ships would be stranded, aircraft would be grounded, tanks would sit idle, the war machine would grind to a halt within months. From the American perspective, the embargo was a way to pressure Japan into withdrawing from China and ending its aggression without going to war. It was economic warfare, painful, but preferable to sending troops. But from the Japanese perspective, it was an existential threat. In Tokyo, military and political leaders gathered in tense meetings. They reviewed stockpiles, they calculated timelines, they debated options. The numbers were stark. Japan had enough oil reserves to sustain operations for approximately 18 months. After that, the military would be paralysed, the empire would collapse, everything they had fought for would be lost. One faction argued for negotiation. Perhaps if Japan made concessions, withdrew from some territories, agreed to certain restrictions, the United States would lift the embargo. War could be avoided. Another faction argued for war. They saw the embargo as proof that the United States would never allow Japan to be a true power. Negotiation was pointless. The only option was to strike first, hard, fast and decisively, before Japan's resources ran out. The debate raged for months, but as summer turned to fall, the balance tipped toward war. The plan that emerged was bold and risky. If conflict with the United States was inevitable, Japan would not wait for its oil reserves to run dry. It would launch a preemptive strike designed to cripple American naval power in the Pacific. With the Pacific Fleet destroyed, Japan could seize the oil-rich territories of Southeast Asia, the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, the Philippines. By the time the United States rebuilt its fleet, Japan would control enough resources to sustain a long war. And perhaps, faced with the cost of reconquest, America would negotiate a peace that allowed Japan to keep at least some of its gains. The target was chosen: Pearl Harbor. The logic was simple. Pearl Harbor was the home of the Pacific Fleet. If the fleet could be destroyed at anchor, Japan would have months, perhaps years, of freedom to operate without American interference. The plan was unprecedented. No carrier-based strike force had ever attempted an operation at such range. The logistics were staggering, the risks were enormous, but Japanese military planners believed it could work. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, oversaw the planning. Yamamoto was a realist. He had studied at Harvard. He had served in Washington as a naval attaché. He understood American industrial power, and he had serious doubts about Japan's ability to win a prolonged war against the United States. But if war was coming, and by the fall of 1941 he believed it was, then the only chance Japan had was to strike first and strike hard. Yamamoto famously told his colleagues, "I can run wild for 6 months, maybe a year. After that I have no confidence." It was not it was boast. It was a warning. Diplomatic talks continued throughout the fall, but they were little more than theatre. Japanese diplomats in Washington met with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, presenting proposals and counter-proposals. Hull listened politely and rejected them all. The United States demanded that Japan withdraw from China and Indochina. Japan refused. Both sides knew that the talks were going nowhere, but both sides continued them anyway. Japan to buy time for military preparations, and the United States because Roosevelt had promised to exhaust all diplomatic options before going to war. By late November, the situation had reached a breaking point. American intelligence agencies were watching Japan closely. They knew that Japanese military activity was increasing. They knew that diplomatic relations were deteriorating. They knew that troop movements suggested mobilization for war. But knowing that something is coming is not the same as knowing when or where, and that is where the conspiracy theory finds its foothold. Because if American leaders knew that war with Japan was inevitable, if they understood that the embargo had backed Japan into a corner, then they also knew that an attack was likely. Some researchers argue that this was not an accident. They argue that the embargo was designed to provoke Japan into striking first, giving the United States the moral and political justification to enter the war. The timing supports this interpretation. The embargo was imposed in July 1941. Pearl Harbor was attacked in December. That's 5 months, almost exactly the amount of time Japanese planners would need to prepare a major operation. Did Roosevelt know that the embargo would force Japan's hand? Did he understand that economic pressure would lead to military action? And if so, did he accept that risk because he wanted Japan to attack? Again, this is interpretation, not proven fact. But the timeline raises uncomfortable questions. Why impose an embargo so severe that it left Japan with no option but war? Why continue diplomatic talks that both sides knew were pointless? And why leave the Pacific Fleet concentrated in one location, vulnerable and exposed? Some argue that these were reasonable actions taken by a leader trying to deter aggression without starting a war. Others argue that they were calculated moves designed to engineer the exact outcome that occurred. By late November 1941, the pieces were all in place. Japan had committed to war, the United States had drawn its line, and somewhere in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, a carrier fleet was steaming toward Hawaii in absolute radio silence. 6 aircraft carriers, over 400 aircraft, thousands of highly trained pilots and sailors, the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled, and no one in Hawaii knew they were coming. The question is not whether American leaders knew war was coming, the question is whether they knew where and did nothing. Chapter 3. Intelligence Signals. Before the attack. Intelligence work is often a puzzle with missing pieces. You collect fragments of information, radio intercepts, troop movements, diplomatic cables, reconnaissance reports, and you try to assemble them into a picture. Sometimes the picture is clear, sometimes it is not, and sometimes you only understand what you were looking at after the fact. In the months and weeks leading up to Pearl Harbor, American intelligence agencies were collecting a massive volume of data on Japanese activity. They were intercepting Japanese diplomatic communications through a program known as MAGIC. They were monitoring naval movements, they were analysing patterns, they were watching, listening, recording, and they were seeing warning signs. Throughout the fall of 1941, intercepted messages showed that Japan was preparing for something significant. Diplomatic codes indicated that negotiations were failing. Military codes revealed increased activity across the Pacific. Fleet movements suggested mobilization. Lieutenant Commander Alwyn Kramer worked in the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington. His job was to translate and analyze intercepted Japanese communications. He spent his days hunched over coded messages, working through the tedious process of decryption and interpretation. In late November, the messages became more urgent. On November 19th, Tokyo sent a message to its embassy in Washington. The situation is nearing a crisis. Time is running out. On November 22nd, another message. There are reasons beyond your ability to guess why we want to settle Japanese-American relations by the 25th. Kramer knew what these messages meant. Deadlines in diplomatic communications are never arbitrary. They signal intent. They indicate that decisions have been made, but the messages were not specific. They did not say, "We are going to attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Instead, they painted a picture of general escalation. Something was coming. But where? The Philippines? Malaya? The Dutch East Indies? All of these were considered more likely targets than Hawaii. Still, there were clues that should have raised alarms. On November 24th, American intelligence intercepted a message from Tokyo to the Japanese consulate in Honolulu. The message requested detailed information about ship movements in Pearl Harbor, which ships were in port, where they were moored, how many were present. This was unusual. Why would Japan need such specific information about Pearl Harbor unless it was planning an operation there? The message was noted. It was filed. It was not flagged as urgent. 3 days later, another message requested an update. Tokyo wanted to know if the information was still accurate. They wanted current data. Again, the message was intercepted, translated, and filed. No alarm was raised. Then, in late November, American intelligence intercepted a message instructing Japanese diplomats in Washington to destroy their code machines. This was a clear sign that war was imminent. When diplomats destroy code machines, it means they are preparing to cease operations. It means that communication is about to end, and that actions, not words, are coming next. Intelligence officers in Washington recognized the significance immediately. Warnings were sent to military commanders across the Pacific, including those in Hawaii. But the warnings were vague. They emphasized vigilance and readiness, but did not specify a threat. The language was cautious, bureaucratic, non-committal. This dispatch is to be considered a war warning. An aggressive move by Japan is expected within the next few days. That was the message sent to Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, on November 27th. It told him that war was likely. It told him to be alert, but it did not tell him where the attack would come. It did not identify Pearl Harbor as a potential target. It did not convey urgency beyond the general sense that something might happen soon. Kimmel read the message. He discussed it with his staff, and he concluded that the threat was primarily to American interests in the Western Pacific, the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island. Hawaii seemed too far from Japan to be a realistic target. Then there was the matter of the missing carriers. American intelligence had been tracking the movements of Japanese aircraft carriers throughout the year. Carriers were Japan's most powerful offensive weapons. They were the platform for launching airstrikes across vast distances. If Japan was planning a major operation, the carriers would be central to it. But in late November, the carriers disappeared. One by one, they stopped appearing in radio intercepts. Their locations became unknown. Intelligence analysts lost track of them. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton was the Pacific Fleet's intelligence officer. He worked directly under Kimmel, providing daily briefings on enemy activity. On December 2nd, Kimmel asked Layton where the Japanese carriers were. Layton had to admit he didn't know. Kimmel pressed, "Do you mean to say they could be rounding Diamond Head and you wouldn't know it?" Layton replied, "I hope they would be sighted before that." It was said as a joke. Neither man believed the carriers were anywhere near Hawaii, but they were. The Japanese strike force, 6 carriers and their escorts, had left the Kuril Islands on November 26th. They steamed eastward across the North Pacific, maintaining strict radio silence. They refueled at sea. They avoided shipping lanes. They travelled through some of the most remote waters on Earth. And American intelligence had no idea where they were. Some analysts assumed the carriers were in home waters, preparing for operations in Southeast Asia. Others speculated they might be heading toward the Philippines, but no one seriously considered that they might be heading for Hawaii. Conspiracy theorists point to this moment as critical. They argue that losing track of Japan's most powerful weapons should have triggered alarm bells at the highest levels. They argue that if intelligence agencies could not locate the carriers, the logical assumption should have been that they were preparing for a surprise attack, and that Pearl Harbor, the largest American naval base in the Pacific, was an obvious potential target. But that is hindsight speaking. At the time, most military analysts believed that Pearl Harbor was too far from Japan to be a realistic target. Conventional wisdom held that carriers could not operate effectively at such a distance. The logistics were considered too difficult, the risk too great. Naval officers in Washington ran the calculations. A carrier strike on Pearl Harbor would require Japan to send its fleet nearly 4,000 miles across open ocean, attack a heavily defended base, and then return before running out of fuel. The operation seemed impossible, or at least highly improbable. So even though the carriers were missing, even though tensions were at their peak, even though warnings had been issued, Pearl Harbor was not seen as the most likely target. And yet, some intelligence officers did express concern. Some reports suggested that Hawaii should be on alert. Some analysts noted the possibility of a surprise attack. Were those warnings heard? Were they acted on? Or were they dismissed because they contradicted prevailing assumptions? In late November, a young intelligence analyst named Rufus Bratton was working in the Army's Military Intelligence Division in Washington. He had been reviewing intercepts and was troubled by what he saw. A pattern suggested that Japan was preparing for immediate action. The deadlines were tight. The tone was final. Bratton believed that war could break out within days. He tried to convey this urgency to his superiors. He recommended that Pacific commanders be given more specific warnings. He suggested that reconnaissance flights be increased around Hawaii. His recommendations were acknowledged, but they were not fully implemented. Part of the problem was bureaucracy. Intelligence was compartmentalized. Different agencies collected different types of information and did not always share effectively. The Navy had its intelligence operation. The Army had its own. The State Department had diplomatic channels. The FBI monitored domestic threats. Coordination was poor. Part of the problem was interpretation. The same set of facts could be read in different ways depending on your assumptions. If you believed that Pearl Harbor was too far from Japan to be attacked, then you interpreted the intelligence to fit that belief. If you believed that Japan would strike closer targets first, then you looked for evidence supporting that conclusion. And part of the problem may have been intent. Because if leaders in Washington wanted Japan to strike first, if they needed a catalyst to bring the nation into war, then the best way to ensure that outcome was to see the warning signs, acknowledge them, and then do just enough to appear vigilant without actually preventing the attack. This is the core of the conspiracy theory. Not that intelligence agencies were incompetent, but that they were following orders to collect information, to file reports, to send warnings that were worded carefully enough to provide cover later, but vague enough to ensure that field commanders did not take decisive action. By early December, American intelligence knew that war was imminent. They knew Japan was planning military operations. They knew the carriers were missing. They knew that diplomatic relations had collapsed. What they did not know, or claimed not to know, was where the blow would fall. And on the skyst morning of December the 7th, 1941, the world found out. But here's what makes the conspiracy theory so compelling. After the attack, when investigators reviewed the intelligence records, they found that almost every piece of the puzzle had been in place. The warnings had been there, the indicators had been clear, the pattern in retrospect was obvious. The question is not whether the information existed. The question is whether anyone chose to act on it, or whether someone chose not to. Chapter 4. The Broken Chain of Command. Command is a chain. Information flows up, orders flow down, and when that chain breaks, the consequences can be catastrophic. In Hawaii, the chain was fractured long before the first bombs fell. At the top of the Pacific Fleet command structure was Admiral Husband Edward Kimmel. 59 years old, a career naval officer with decades of experience, Kimmel had been appointed to command the Pacific Fleet in February 1941. He was responsible for naval operations across the entire Pacific Ocean, a vast area of water covering millions of square miles. His headquarters were at Pearl Harbor, where the bulk of the fleet was stationed. 8 battleships, 3 aircraft carriers, dozens of cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels, tens of thousands of sailors. This was the most powerful naval force in the Pacific, and Kimmel was responsible for keeping it safe and ready. But Kimmel faced challenges that went beyond simple military readiness. The Pacific Fleet was in transition. It had only recently been moved from its traditional base in San Diego to Pearl Harbor, a decision made to project American power westward and signal to Japan that the United States would not tolerate further expansion. But Pearl Harbor had limitations as a naval base. Its facilities were still being developed. Its defences were incomplete. And it was closer to potential threats than San Diego had been. Kimmel had requested additional reconnaissance aircraft to patrol the waters around Hawaii. He wanted more submarines to extend his surveillance range. He wanted better intelligence on Japanese movements. Many of his requests were denied or delayed. Resources were prioritised for the Atlantic, where German U-boats were attacking supply convoys to Britain. The Pacific was seen as a lower priority. Kimmel was told to make do with what he had. Still, he did not believe Pearl Harbor was at risk. This was not arrogance. It was a reasonable assessment based on the information he had been given. Intelligence reports emphasized threats to the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. The prevailing military wisdom held that Japan would strike at weaker, closer targets before challenging American naval power directly. When Kimmel received the war warning on November 27th, he took it seriously. He consulted with his staff. He reviewed his defensive posture, and he concluded that the threat was to American interests in the Western Pacific, not to Hawaii itself. He increased patrols slightly. He reviewed security procedures, but he did not place the fleet on full alert. Ships continued their normal routines. Sailors went ashore on liberty. Sunday, December the 7th, was scheduled as a day of rest. The army was responsible for the defence of the Hawaiian Islands themselves, including the air bases and installations surrounding Pearl Harbor. That responsibility fell to Lieutenant General Walter Campbell Short. 51 years old, a career army officer, Short had taken command of the Hawaiian Department in February 1941, the same month Kimmel arrived. Like Kimmel, Short believed that the greater threat to Hawaii came from sabotage, not external attack. This belief shaped his decisions in profound ways. Hawaii had a large population of Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans. Some military officials worried that this population could be a security risk, that saboteurs might try to damage aircraft, ships, or facilities if war broke out. Short took these concerns seriously. Throughout late November and early December, Short implemented measures to protect against sabotage. He ordered aircraft parked close together on airfields, where they could be more easily guarded. He increased security at key facilities. He focused on preventing internal threats. What he did not do was disperse the aircraft to make them harder targets in case of air attack. He did not increase air patrols over the surrounding ocean. He did not place his forces on full combat alert. Again, this was not incompetence. It was a decision based on the guidance he had received from Washington. And that guidance was vague. On November 27th, both Kimmel and Short received warning messages from Washington. The Army message to Short read, "Hostile action possible at any moment. If hostilities cannot be avoided, the United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act. This policy should not be construed as restricting you to a course of action that might jeopardize your defense. Read that carefully. The message says that hostile action is possible. It says that Japan should commit the first overt act, meaning the United States should not strike first. But it also says that Short should not let policy jeopardize his defense. It's contradictory. It tells Short to be ready while simultaneously telling him not to do anything that might provoke Japan. Short interpreted this to mean he should focus on preventing sabotage while avoiding actions that might look aggressive, like dispersing aircraft or increasing patrols. He did not want to be blamed for triggering a war through overly aggressive defensive measures. The Navy message to Kimmel was slightly different but equally vague. This dispatch is to be considered a war warning. An aggressive move by Japan is expected within the next few days. Execute appropriate defensive deployment. Again, the message confirms that war is likely, but it does not specify where the attack might come. It does not identify Pearl Harbor as a target. It does not convey the level of urgency that would justify disrupting normal operations. Kimmel and Short discussed the warnings. They agreed that the situation was serious. They agreed that vigilance was needed. But neither believed that Pearl Harbor was in immediate danger, and here is where the conspiracy theory becomes most pointed. Because the warnings sent to Hawaii were not the only warnings issued. Intelligence reports in Washington painted a much clearer picture of the threat. Messages intercepted from Japanese diplomats indicated that war would begin soon. Analysts had noted the disappearance of the carrier fleet. Some officials in Washington believed that Hawaii could be at risk. But the warnings sent to Kimmel and Short did not reflect that level of concern. Why not? Conspiracy theorists argue that this was intentional. They suggest that the warnings were deliberately softened to avoid triggering defensive measures that might have prevented or mitigated the attack. They point to the fact that Washington had access to intelligence that was not shared with field commanders. They note that higher-level officials understood the strategic picture in ways that Kimmel and Short did not. If the goal was to allow an attack to happen, to create the catalyst needed to bring the nation into war, then the best way to achieve that goal was to keep commanders in Hawaii just informed enough to avoid suspicion, but not informed enough to act effectively. This is speculation, not proof. But it explains a pattern that official investigations struggle to reconcile. How intelligence agencies in Washington could see the threat so clearly, while commanders in Hawaii remained in the dark. Consider the chain of command. Intelligence is collected by field operatives and technical specialists. It is analysed by mid-level officers in various agencies. It is summarised in reports for senior officials. Those officials decide what information to share with field commanders and how to phrase the warnings. At each step in this chain, information can be filtered, softened or withheld. And if someone at the top wanted to ensure that a field commander did not overreact, all they would need to do is control the flow of information down the chain. In the days leading up to December 7th, Kimmel and Short asked Washington for clarification. They wanted to know if the threat was serious enough to disrupt training schedules, cancel liberty, and place their forces on full alert. They were told to use their judgment. That's not guidance. That's deniability. Because if the attack succeeded, Washington could say, "We warned them, they failed to act." And if the attack was prevented, Washington could say, "We told them not to overreact and provoke Japan." Either way, those at the top, those were protected. Kimmel and Short, on the other hand, were exposed. By the morning of December the 7th, they had done what they believed was appropriate based on the information they had. Ships were in port because it was Sunday. Aircraft were parked because the primary threat was thought to be sabotage. Defensive measures focused on internal security, and then the sky filled with enemy planes. Afterward, both men would be blamed for the disaster. They were relieved of command within weeks of the attack. Their careers were destroyed. Their reputations were shattered. Official investigations would cite failures in judgment, failures in communication, failures in leadership. But some would argue that the real failure was not theirs. It was the failure of those who saw the warning signs and chose to send messages that sounded like warnings but functioned like silence. Chapter 5. the radar contact. Sometimes history turns on a single moment, a decision made, a rare message ignored, a chance missed. For Pearl Harbor, that moment came just after 7 in the morning. Privates Joseph Lockard and George Elliott were stationed at the Opana radar station on the northern tip of Oahu. The station was little more than a collection of equipment mounted on a truck, parked on a windswept point overlooking the ocean. Radar was a relatively new technology in 1941. Most military officers didn't fully understand it. The installation at Opana was part of an experimental network designed to detect incoming aircraft and provide early warning of an attack. The equipment was temperamental. The operators were still learning. Training had been minimal, but when it worked well. On the morning of December 7th, Lockard and Elliott had started their shift at 4 in the morning. Their job was to monitor the radar screen and report any unusual contacts to the information centre at Fort Shafter, the hub that coordinated radar reports and managed the air defence network. Their shift was supposed to end at 7 in the morning, but the truck that was supposed to pick them up and take them back to base was running late, so they decided to keep the equipment running while they waited. At 7 and 2 minutes, Lockard noticed something on the screen, a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north. The contact was strong, unusually so. He checked the equipment. Everything was functioning normally. He called Elliott over. Together they watched the blip on the screen. It was moving fast. Range, 137 miles. Bearing, almost due north. Elliott suggested they report it. Lockard hesitated. It was past their shift time. Maybe it was a malfunction. Maybe it was just a flock of birds. Radar could pick up large bird formations sometimes, but the contact kept getting stronger. Lockard calculated the speed and trajectory. Whatever it was heading directly toward Oahu. Lockard picked up the phone and called the information centre at Fort Shafter. The phone rang several times before it was answered. Most of the staff had gone to breakfast. The only person still there was a pursuit officer, a junior lieutenant named Kermit Tyler. Tyler was filling in for a more senior officer who was not on duty that morning. It was only his second day working in the information centre. He had limited experience with the radar network. He was not fully briefed on the strategic situation. Lockard explained what they were seeing. A large formation of aircraft, 137 miles out, approaching fast. Tyler listened. He thought for a moment. Then he said, "Don't worry about it." Lockard pressed. This was a really large contact, bigger than anything they'd seen during training. Shouldn't someone check it out? Tyler repeated, "Don't worry about it." He later explained that he had assumed the radar contact was a flight of American bombers expected to arrive from the mainland that morning. He knew that a group of planes was due. He thought the timing matched. He didn't think it was necessary to verify, but Tyler didn't check with anyone. He didn't consult a schedule. He didn't call the airfields to confirm. He made an assumption and acted on it. Lockard hung up the phone. He and Elliott continued tracking the formation. The contact kept getting closer. 100 miles, 75 miles, 50 miles. At 30 miles out, the contact disappeared from the screen, lost in the clutter of the island's terrain as the aircraft descended toward their targets. Lockard and Elliott shut down the equipment. Their ride finally arrived. They drove back to base, talking about the strange contact and wondering what Tyler had meant when he said not to worry. 20 minutes later, the attack began. This moment has become central to the conspiracy debate, because here was a clear, unambiguous warning. Radar detected the incoming strike force more than 50 minutes before the first bombs fell. That was enough time to scramble fighters, enough time to alert the fleet, enough time to sound air raid sirens, enough time to man anti-aircraft guns, enough time to prepare. But the warning was dismissed by a junior officer who made an assumption without verification. The official explanation is simple: confusion, inexperience, bad luck. Tyler made a mistake. He didn't know any better. Lockard and Elliott followed orders and did not push back. The system failed at the worst possible moment. But conspiracy theorists ask a different question. Why was the radar network operating with minimal personnel that morning? Why was a junior officer with limited experience put in charge of coordinating reports during a period of heightened tension? Why was there no procedure to verify unusual contacts before dismissing them? Some suggest that the radar network was deliberately understaffed and under-prioritized. They argue that if leadership wanted to ensure that an attack would succeed, one way to do that would be to make sure that early warning systems were not taken seriously, to create an environment where ambiguous signals could be explained away without investigation. This is not provable, but it fits a pattern. Because the radar contact was not the only warning ignored that morning. At 6:45, more than an hour before the attack, the destroyer USS Ward was patrolling the entrance to Pearl Harbor when a lookout spotted something unusual: the conning tower of a small submarine. The submarine was in restricted waters, trying to follow an American cargo ship into the harbour. The captain of the Ward, Lieutenant William Outerbridge, ordered his guns to fire. The first shot missed. The second hit the submarine's conning tower. The submarine began to sink. The Ward dropped depth charges to finish it off. Outerbridge immediately reported the engagement by radio. "We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges on a submarine operating in defensive sea area." This was not ambiguous. This was not a radar blip that might be friendly aircraft. This was an enemy submarine sunk in American waters. The report was received at the headquarters of the 14th Naval District, which oversaw Pearl Harbor's defences. The duty officer, Lieutenant Commander Harold Kaminsky, saw the message. He knew it was significant. He called his superior, Admiral Claude Bloch. Bloch was sceptical. There had been false submarine sightings before. He told Kaminsky to verify the report before taking action. Kaminsky tried to reach the Ward for confirmation, but radio communication was difficult. Minutes passed. More calls were made. Officers deliberated. Should they sound an alert? Should they wake up Admiral Kimmel? While they debated, time ran out. At 7:55, the first wave of Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. Afterward, investigators would call these failures tragic mistakes, examples of how peacetime complacency and communication breakdowns can lead to disaster. But critics point out that these were not isolated incidents. They were part of a broader pattern of warnings seen, reported, and then set aside. Radar detected the incoming strike force, ignored. A submarine was sunk in defensive waters, debated. Every single early warning mechanism functioned correctly. The technology worked. The people did their jobs. The information reached decision makers, but every decision maker chose not to act. Was it really just coincidence that every single safeguard failed at the exact same time? Or was the system designed to fail? This is the question that refuses to go away. Because if Pearl Harbor was truly a surprise, then the failures that allowed it to happen were almost impossibly unlucky. Radar worked perfectly but was dismissed. Submarines were detected and sunk but not reported effectively. Warnings were issued but phrased vaguely enough to be ignored. But if Pearl Harbor was allowed to happen, then those same failures start to look like something else. Not mistakes, choices, because the best way to ensure that an attack succeeds is not to disable the defences. It's to make sure that when the defences sound the alarm, no one listens. Chapter 6. The Attack and Immediate Aftermath. At 7:55 on the morning of December the 7th, 1941, the first wave of Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the attack from his position in a level bomber high above the harbour. Below him, the American fleet lay at anchor in neat rows, exactly as intelligence reports had described. 8 battleships along Battleship Row, cruisers and destroyers in the harbour, aircraft parked wing to wing on the airfields. Fuchida gave the signal, "Tora! Tora! Tora! Tiger! Tiger! Tiger!" The code that meant they had achieved complete surprise. 183 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and level bombers descended on the harbour in coordinated waves. The attack was precise, devastating, and overwhelming. Within minutes, the harbour was engulfed in chaos. The first bombs fell on the airfields. At Hickam Field, Army Air Corps personnel were eating breakfast when they heard explosions. They ran outside and saw aircraft with red circles on their wings strafing the parked planes. Fuel tanks exploded. Hangars collapsed. Men dove for cover as machine gun fire tore through buildings. At Wheeler Field, rows of fighters sat parked close together, a perfect target. Japanese pilots made low passes, firing into the clustered aircraft. Within minutes, most of the fighters were destroyed or damaged beyond use. Pilots sprinted toward the few planes that were still intact, desperate to get airborne. Lieutenant George Welch and Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor managed to reach an auxiliary field where a few P-40 fighters had been dispersed. They took off without orders, without clearance, without waiting for permission. They climbed into the smoke-filled sky and engaged the Japanese aircraft. They were among the few American pilots to get airborne that morning. On Battleship Row, sailors heard the explosions from the airfields and looked up to see aircraft approaching. Some still thought it was a drill. Then they saw the torpedoes in the water. The torpedoes were specially designed for Pearl Harbor. The harbor was shallow, only 40 feet deep in many places. Standard torpedoes would have hit the bottom before reaching their targets. So Japanese engineers modified the torpedoes with wooden fins that allowed them to run shallow. It was an innovation that would prove devastatingly effective. The USS Oklahoma was hit first. 3 torpedoes struck her port side within seconds. The battleship shuddered. Water poured into the hull through massive holes. The ship began to list. Sailors below decks heard the explosions and felt the ship tilting. They tried to evacuate, but the corridors were flooding. Watertight doors were being sealed to slow the flooding, trapping men inside. The lights went out. In the darkness, men scrambled upward, trying to reach the open air. The Oklahoma continued to roll. 5 minutes after the first torpedo hit, she capsized completely. Her masts touched the harbour bottom. Her hull rose into the air red with rust and covered in barnacles. Inside, more than 400 men were trapped. Some were in compartments that still had air. They pounded on the bulkheads, shouting for help. They could hear rescue crews on the outside trying to cut through the steel. But the Oklahoma's hull was thick armour plate. Cutting through it would take time. For some, help arrived. Rescue crews worked through the night, using torches to burn through the metal. 32 men were pulled out alive over the next day. For the others, no help came in time. The USS West Virginia took 6 torpedo hits and 2 bomb hits. She settled into the harbour mud, leaning against the USS Tennessee, which was moored alongside her. The Tennessee was trapped, unable to move. The USS Arizona took a direct hit from an armour-piercing bomb at 8 and 6 minutes. The bomb was a modified 16-inch naval shell dropped from altitude. It punched through the deck and detonated in the forward ammunition magazine. The explosion was so powerful that it lifted the entire ship out of the water. Men on nearby vessels saw a massive fireball erupt from the Arizona's bow. Debris, metal, equipment, human remains rained down across the harbour. The force of the blast was felt miles away. The Arizona's forward structure collapsed. Fire engulfed the ship. Fuel oil spread across the water, igniting into a sea of flame. Men jumped overboard, only to find themselves swimming through burning oil. The Arizona sank in less than 9 minutes. Of her crew of 1,500, more than 1,000 died. Most never made it out of the ship. They were killed instantly by the explosion or trapped below decks as the ship went down. Even today, the Arizona leaks oil. Droplets rise to the surface, slow, steady, endless. They call them the Tears of the Arizona. The USS Nevada was the only battleship that managed to get underway during the attack. Her crew saw the assault developing and made a desperate attempt to reach the open ocean. They cut the mooring lines and started moving down the channel toward the harbour entrance. Japanese pilots saw the Nevada moving and concentrated their attack on her. If the Nevada could be sunk in the channel, she would block the entire harbour, trapping every other ship inside. Bombs struck the Nevada's deck. Fire broke out. The ship was taking heavy damage. Realizing that she might not make it to open water, and knowing that sinking in the channel would be disastrous, the Nevada's captain deliberately ran her aground near Hospital Point. She would survive, but she would not escape. The USS California took 2 torpedo hits and settled slowly into the mud. The USS Maryland and USS Pennsylvania were damaged but remained afloat. The USS Tennessee, trapped by the sinking West Virginia, suffered bomb damage but stayed operational. By the time the first wave ended, Battleship Row was a vision of hell. Ships burning. Smoke so thick it turned day into twilight. Bodies in the water. Wreckage everywhere. The harbour was covered in oil that burned with a thick black smoke. And then the second wave arrived. 170 aircraft struck an hour after the first wave. They targeted ships that had survived the initial attack. They hit fuel depots, repair facilities, dry docks. They strafed anything that moved. American forces fought back desperately. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the sky with bursts of shrapnel. Sailors worked to save their ships, battling fires and flooding with whatever tools they had. Some used buckets to bail water. Some formed human chains to pass ammunition to gun crews. Men performed acts of extraordinary courage. Petty Officer Doris Miller, a cook on the USS West Virginia, carried wounded sailors to safety, then manned an anti-aircraft gun, a weapon he had never been trained to use, and fired at Japanese aircraft until he ran out of ammunition. Captain Mervyn Bennion, commanding officer of the West Virginia, was mortally wounded by shrapnel but refused to leave his post. He continued giving orders even as he bled out on the deck. At 10 in the morning, it was over. The Japanese aircraft turned north and flew back toward their carriers, which were waiting 200 miles away. They had achieved near-total surprise. They had inflicted catastrophic damage. They had lost only 29 aircraft and fewer than 100 men. The United States lost 8 battleships, either sunk or heavily damaged. 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers were destroyed, or damaged. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed, most on the ground. More than 2,000 Americans were dead. Another 1,000 were wounded. Pearl Harbor, the heart of American naval power in the Pacific, was crippled. But there was something else that happened that day, something less visible but equally significant. The nation united. Before December 7th, America was divided. Isolationists and interventionists argued bitterly about the war in Europe and Asia. Public opinion was fragmented. Congress was gridlocked. Mothers protested. Politicians campaigned on neutrality. The America First Committee held rallies. After December 7th, all of that evaporated. The attack was seen as treacherous, unprovoked, and barbaric. The fact that it came while Japanese diplomats were still in Washington conducting peace negotiations made it even worse. Americans were outraged. The debate over intervention ended instantly. People who had never agreed on anything suddenly agreed on one thing. Japan had to be stopped. Recruiting stations were overwhelmed with volunteers. Young men lined up for blocks, desperate to enlist. Women volunteered for defence work. Factories began converting to military production. The entire nation mobilised with a speed and unity that had seemed impossible just days before. On December 8th, President Roosevelt addressed Congress. His speech was brief, direct, and powerful. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. He called for a declaration of war. The vote was nearly unanimous. Only one representative, Jeannette Rankin, a pacifist who had also voted against entry into the First World War, voted against it. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, honouring their alliance with Japan. America was now fully committed to the Second World War. In the space of a single morning, everything changed. And this is where the conspiracy theory finds its deepest resonance. Because the outcome of Pearl Harbor was exactly what Roosevelt and his advisors had said was needed. The nation was united. Public opinion shifted overnight. The political obstacles to entering the war vanished. The isolationists were silenced. The debate was over. Critics argue that this is too convenient to be coincidental. They point out that the attack achieved every strategic goal that American leadership had been unable to accomplish through diplomacy or persuasion. It gave the United States the moral high ground. It justified full mobilization. It silenced opposition. Official history says that these outcomes were the result of Japanese aggression and American resilience. The conspiracy theory says they were the result of calculated risk, a gamble that the cost of allowing an attack would be worth the benefit of entering the war, united. To be clear, there is no definitive proof that Roosevelt or his administration deliberately allowed Pearl Harbor to happen. But the question persists because the political and strategic context makes the theory plausible, and because the investigations that followed left too many questions unanswered. The fires burned for days. Bodies were pulled from the water and from the wreckage. Survivors wandered in shock, some still covered in oil, some badly burned. And in Washington, officials began preparing their defense. Not defense against Japan, defense against the questions that would inevitably come. How did this happen? Who was responsible? What did you know? And when did you know it? Chapter 7. The Investigations. After Pearl Harbor, the nation demanded answers. How could this have happened? How could the most powerful navy in the world be caught so completely off guard? Who was responsible? Who should be punished? Over the next several years, multiple investigations were conducted, committees formed, hearings were held, witnesses testified, documents were reviewed, and when it was all over, the conclusions were complex, contradictory, and politically charged. The first investigation began immediately after the attack. It was led by Supreme Court Justice Owen Roberts and included 2 Army generals and 2 Navy admirals. The Roberts Commission was tasked with determining why Pearl Harbor's defences had failed and who was to blame. The commission worked quickly. They arrived in Hawaii on December 22nd, just 15 days after the attack. They interviewed witnesses, they reviewed communications, they examined defensive procedures. On January 23, 1942, they released their findings. The conclusion was damning. Admiral Kimmel and General Short had not taken adequate defensive measures, despite receiving warnings. They had failed to coordinate their defences. They had not properly assessed the threat. They were guilty of dereliction of duty. Both men were immediately relieved of command. Their careers were over, their reputations were destroyed. But Kimmel and Short protested. They argued that the warnings they had received had been vague and incomplete. They claimed that critical intelligence had been withheld from them. They pointed out that Washington had access to information that was never shared with Hawaii. They demanded access to classified materials to defend themselves. Their requests were denied. National security, they were told. Wartime secrecy. The intelligence sources could not be revealed. The investigation moved forward without allowing Kimmel and Short to see the evidence that might have exonerated them. Further investigations followed. A Navy Court of Inquiry in 1944, an Army Board later that same year, a joint congressional investigation in 1945 and 1946. Each one examined communications intelligence, reports and decisions made in the weeks before the attack. Each one produced thousands of pages of testimony and analysis. The findings were consistent in some areas and contradictory in others. All of the investigations concluded that there had been failures in communication. Intelligence agencies had not shared information effectively. Warnings had been misunderstood or downplayed. Commanders in Hawaii had not been fully informed of the strategic picture. But none of the investigations found evidence of deliberate negligence or conspiracy. Responsibility was spread across multiple agencies. Some officials were criticised, some procedures were changed. But no single person beyond Kimmel and Short was held accountable for the broader systemic failures. Conspiracy theorists point to the investigations as further evidence of a cover-up. They note that many intelligence documents were classified and withheld from public scrutiny. They argue that the investigations focused on field commanders while protecting higher-level officials. They claim that uncomfortable questions were deflected or ignored. One of the most controversial aspects of the investigations involved the magic intercepts, the decoded Japanese diplomatic messages that American intelligence had been reading for months. The existence of magic was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. The ability to read Japanese codes gave the United States an enormous intelligence advantage, and protecting that advantage was considered vital to winning the war. During the early investigations, magic was not mentioned. Witnesses were instructed not to discuss it. Documents referencing magic were withheld. Even the investigators did not have full access to the intercepts. This meant that critical pieces of evidence, messages that might have shown how much Washington knew and when they knew it, were kept out of the official record. It wasn't until after the war ended that magic was declassified, and researchers could finally examine the full scope of intelligence available before Pearl Harbor. What they found was troubling. The intercepts showed that American intelligence had been reading Japanese diplomatic communications for months. They had seen messages indicating that war was imminent. They had intercepted requests for detailed information about Pearl Harbor. They had decoded messages setting deadlines and discussing military preparations. In hindsight, the intelligence was much clearer than officials had admitted during the investigations. But by the time these documents were declassified, most of the key figures were dead. Roosevelt had died in 1945. Many of the senior military officers from 1941 had retired or passed away. The historical record was incomplete, and definitive answers remained elusive. What the investigations did establish was a pattern of institutional failure. Intelligence agencies operated in silos. The Army had its intelligence service. The Navy had its own. The FBI monitored domestic threats. The State Department handled diplomatic intelligence. Each agency collected information, but did not always share effectively with the others. Communication between military branches was poor. The Army was responsible for defending Hawaii from land-based threats. The Navy was responsible for defending against sea-based threats. But there was no unified command structure. No one person was responsible for coordinating all defensive efforts. Assumptions went unchallenged. The prevailing belief that Pearl Harbor was too far from Japan to be attacked was never seriously questioned. Intelligence that contradicted this assumption was dismissed or explained away. Warnings were diluted as they moved through bureaucracy. Clear, urgent assessments from mid-level analysts were softened into vague, bureaucratic language by the time they reached senior officials, and by the time they reached field commanders they had lost most of their urgency. Whether those failures were accidental or intentional is the question that has never been fully resolved. Because in the end, the investigations confirmed that Pearl Harbor could have been prevented, but they did not answer whether anyone chose not to prevent it. Kimmel and Short became the official scapegoats. They were blamed for not doing more with the information they had. But many historians argue that they were set up to fail, given vague warnings, denied critical intelligence, and then blamed when the inevitable happened. Both men spent the rest of their lives trying to clear their names. They wrote letters, they gave interviews, they petitioned for their cases to be reopened. Kimmel died in 1968, still insisting that he had been unfairly blamed for a failure that belonged to Washington. Short died in 1949, bitter and broken. In the decades since, there have been efforts to posthumously restore their ranks and clear their reputations. Some official reviews have concluded that they were not solely responsible for the disaster, but the debate continues. Because if Kimmel and Short were not to blame, then who was? Was it the intelligence agencies that failed to share information? Was it the senior officials who sent vague warnings instead of clear orders? Was it the system itself, designed in a way that made failure almost inevitable? Or was it something more deliberate, a decision made at the highest levels to allow the attack to happen? The investigations never answered that question, and perhaps they were never meant to. Chapter 8. The conspiracy takes shape. In the years following the war, as classified documents were slowly released and veterans began sharing their experiences, a new narrative began to emerge. It started with questions from historians and journalists who noticed inconsistencies in the official record. Why had so much intelligence pointed toward an attack, yet no effective action was taken? Why had field commanders been kept in the dark about the severity of the threat? Why had warnings been so vague? Why had documents been withheld from investigators? Some researchers began to argue that the failures were not failures at all. They were decisions. The conspiracy theory rests on several key claims. First, that American intelligence knew more than it admitted, that the intercepted Japanese communications made it clear that war was imminent and that an attack on Pearl Harbor was possible, if not probable. The magic intercepts support this claim. Messages from late November showed Tokyo setting deadlines, preparing for military action, and requesting detailed intelligence on Pearl Harbor. American codebreakers read these messages in real time. Senior officials in Washington saw them. Second, that this intelligence was deliberately withheld from commanders in Hawaii. That vague warnings were sent not to alert them, but to provide plausible deniability later. The warnings sent to Kimmel and Short emphasized general vigilance, but did not convey the urgency or specificity that would have justified placing Pearl Harbor on full alert. Meanwhile, officials in Washington had access to intelligence that painted a much clearer picture of the threat. Third, that President Roosevelt and his inner circle understood that only a dramatic attack on American soil would unite the nation and justify entry into the war, that they saw Pearl Harbor not as a catastrophe to be prevented, but as an opportunity to be exploited. Roosevelt's political situation in late 1941 supports this interpretation. He believed that American involvement in the war was necessary. He had tried to move public opinion through speeches and diplomacy, but the isolationist movement remained strong. Without a catalyst, he could not bring the nation into the war. And fourth, that after the attack a coordinated effort was made to obscure the truth, that investigations were steered away from uncomfortable conclusions, that documents were classified, that scapegoats were chosen to protect higher-level officials. The handling of the investigation supports this claim. Critical intelligence was withheld. Key witnesses were not allowed to see classified materials. The focus remained on field commanders rather than systemic failures or decisions made in Washington. To be absolutely clear, this is interpretation, not established fact. There is no smoking gun document in which Roosevelt orders Pearl Harbor to be left undefended. There is no memo that says, "Let the attack happen." The evidence is circumstantial, built on patterns of behaviour, withheld intelligence and strategic outcomes. But the theory persists because it offers an explanation for a series of events that otherwise seem inexplicable. How could so many warnings have been missed? How could so many opportunities to prevent the attack have been squandered? How could the outcome have been so perfectly aligned with American strategic interests? Proponents of the conspiracy theory do not claim that Roosevelt wanted Americans to die. They claim that he made a calculated decision, that the cost of allowing an attack, measured in ships, lives and national trauma, was worth the benefit of entering the war united, and with overwhelming public support. It is a cold calculation, a ruthless one. But it is not without precedent in history. Leaders have always faced impossible choices. Winston Churchill allegedly allowed German bombers to destroy Coventry, rather than reveal that British intelligence had broken German codes. Harry Truman ordered atomic bombs dropped on Japanese cities to end the war quickly. Lyndon Johnson escalated American involvement in Vietnam based on questionable intelligence about an attack in the Gulf of Tonkin. Throughout history, leaders have weighed lives against strategy. They have made decisions that cost some to save others. They have chosen silence over transparency when they believed the stakes were high enough. The question is not whether such choices exist. The question is whether Pearl Harbor was one of them. Critics of the conspiracy theory point out that it requires a level of coordination and secrecy that would have been nearly impossible to maintain. It assumes that dozens of officials across multiple agencies all understood the plan and kept silent. It assumes that no one, no aide, no analyst, no clerk, ever spoke out or left evidence of the conspiracy. They argue that the simpler explanation is the correct one, that Pearl Harbor was a genuine surprise enabled by bureaucratic failure, overconfidence, and bad luck. And yet, the questions remain. Because even if the conspiracy theory is not true, the failures that allowed Pearl Harbor to happen were so profound, so systematic, and so consequential that they demand a better answer than mistakes were made, consider the timeline. July 1941, Roosevelt imposes oil embargo on Japan. Late November, Japanese carriers disappear from intelligence tracking. November 27, vague war warnings sent to Hawaii. December 2nd, Kimmel asks where the carriers are. No one knows. December 6th, final intercepts indicate war will begin within hours. December 7th, morning, radar detects incoming aircraft. Warning ignored. December 7th, morning, submarine sunk in defensive waters. Report delayed. December the 7th, 7:55. Attack begins. At every single step there were opportunities to prevent or mitigate the disaster. At every single step those opportunities were not taken. Was that really just bad luck? Or was it something else? That is why the theory endures. Not because there is definitive proof, but because the alternative explanation, that everything went wrong by coincidence, seems almost as hard to believe as the conspiracy itself. Chapter 9. The Moral Question. Strip away the politics, strip away the strategy, strip away the classified documents and the endless debates over who knew what and when. What you're left with is a moral question that has no easy answer. If leaders knew that war was coming, if they knew that Japan was likely to strike, did they have an obligation to prevent that strike, even if it meant prolonging political division and delaying American entry into the war? Or did they have an obligation to allow the strike, understanding that only a direct attack would unite the nation and enable the mobilization needed to defeat fascism? This is the terrain of moral philosophy, not history. And it is the terrain on which the Pearl Harbor conspiracy theory ultimately rests. Let's explore both sides. On one side, there is the argument for transparency and defense. Leaders have a duty to protect their people. That is the most fundamental responsibility of government. If an attack can be prevented, it must be prevented. To knowingly allow Americans to die, even for strategic reasons, is a betrayal of the social contract between government and citizen. The men who died at Pearl Harbor did not consent to be sacrificed. They were sailors and soldiers doing their jobs, trusting that their leaders would do everything possible to keep them safe. If those leaders chose to withhold warnings or intelligence that might have saved lives, then those leaders violated that trust in the most profound way. From this perspective, the ends do not justify the means. Even if allowing Pearl Harbor to happen brought the nation into the war and ultimately saved millions of lives, the decision to sacrifice 2,000 Americans without their knowledge or consent was morally wrong. On the other side, there is the argument for the greater good. Leaders must sometimes make terrible choices. They must weigh competing interests and decide which outcome will cause the least harm in the long run. In late 1941, Roosevelt faced an impossible situation. He believed, correctly, as history would prove, that Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan posed existential threats, not just to their neighbours, but to human freedom itself. Millions were already dying in Europe and Asia. Britain was on the brink of collapse. The Soviet Union was fighting for survival. China was being devastated. If the United States remained neutral, the Axis powers might win. The consequences of that outcome would be catastrophic, not just for Europe and Asia, but eventually for the United States itself. But the American public would not support intervention. They wanted to stay out of foreign wars. They believed the ocean would protect them. No amount of speeches or diplomacy could change their minds. From this perspective, allowing Pearl Harbor to happen, if that's what occurred, was a terrible choice made in service of a greater good. 2,000 lives were lost, but their sacrifice brought the nation into a war that ultimately saved millions and prevented the triumph of totalitarianism. This is utilitarian ethics, the calculation of lives saved versus lives lost, the greater good versus individual rights. It is the same ethical framework that would later justify dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians died, but the alternative, a full invasion of Japan, might have cost millions of lives on both sides. So which framework is correct? That depends on what you believe about the nature of leadership and the limits of acceptable sacrifice. If you believe that leaders must never knowingly sacrifice their own people, then Pearl Harbor, if deliberately allowed, was an unforgivable betrayal. If you believe that leaders must sometimes make terrible choices to prevent even worse outcomes, then Pearl Harbor, if deliberately allowed, was a tragic but necessary decision. There is no right answer. There is only the answer that each person must reach for themselves based on their own moral framework. But consider this thought experiment. Imagine you are President Roosevelt in November 1941. You know that Nazi Germany has conquered most of Europe. You know that the Holocaust is underway, though the full scale is not yet understood. You know that Britain is barely holding on, dependent on American supplies that are being sunk by German submarines. You know that if Britain falls, the United States will face a hostile Europe alone. You know that Japan is expanding across Asia, committing atrocities in China, and threatening American interest in the Pacific. You know that economic pressure has made war with Japan almost inevitable. You know that your own nation refuses to enter the war. 80% of Americans oppose intervention. Congress will not declare war without overwhelming public support. The isolationists are powerful and vocal. You believe deeply, with every fibre of your being, that American involvement is necessary, that without it, the Axis will win and the world will fall into darkness. Then intelligence reports indicate that Japan may be preparing to attack American territory. The attack could be prevented with decisive action, dispersing the fleet, placing Hawaii on full alert, scrambling reconnaissance flights. But preventing the attack means maintaining the status quo. The nation remains divided. The war in Europe continues without American involvement. Millions more die while you watch helplessly. Allowing the attack means accepting terrible losses. Ships will be sunk, men will die, but the nation will unite overnight. Public opinion will shift instantly. Congress will declare war, and American power, industrial, military, moral, will be brought to bear against fascism. What do? Do you prevent the attack and accept that the war may be lost without American involvement? Or do you allow the attack knowing that the lives lost will be the price of victory? This is the question that the Pearl Harbor conspiracy theory forces us to confront, and it has no easy answer, because the truth is, we don't know what we would do in that situation. We can theorize, we can argue, we can apply ethical frameworks, but unless you are actually faced with that choice, unless you bear that responsibility, you cannot know for certain what decision you would make. This is why the conspiracy theory persists even in the absence of definitive proof. Because it asks a question that goes beyond Pearl Harbor. It asks, what are the limits of acceptable sacrifice? It asks, can leaders justify sacrificing some to save others? It asks, who gets to make that decision, and who has to live with the consequences? These are not comfortable questions, but they are the questions that every generation must answer when faced with impossible choices. Pearl Harbor forces us to ask them. Whether the attack was allowed to happen or not, the moral question remains. Chapter 10. Why the question persists. 80 years have passed since Pearl Harbor. The generation that fought the Second World War is almost gone. The ships that sank that day have been memorialized. The Arizona remains underwater, a tomb for the men who never left. The lessons have been studied in military academies around the world. Remember Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry, a warning against complacency. And yet, the question refuses to die. Why? Part of the answer is incomplete information. Many documents related to Pearl Harbor remain classified. Some were destroyed during the war, others were lost or misfiled, and some decisions were made in private conversations that left no record. Phone calls between Roosevelt and his advisors, discussions in the Oval Office, orders given verbally rather than in writing. Without complete transparency, doubt persists. Researchers continue to file Freedom of Information Act requests. Archives are periodically reviewed. Occasionally new documents surface, but the full picture remains elusive. Part of the answer is historical pattern. Pearl Harbor was not the first time that a nation was caught off guard by an attack. And in the decades since, there have been other intelligence failures, other moments where warnings were missed or ignored. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, where reports of North Vietnamese attacks on American ships were later revealed to be exaggerated or misinterpreted, leading to American escalation in Vietnam. The Iranian Revolution in 1979, where American intelligence failed to predict the fall of the Shah despite clear signs of instability. September 11, 2001, where intelligence agencies had information suggesting that terrorists were planning attacks using aircraft, but the warnings were not acted upon effectively. Each time, questions arise. Were these genuine failures, or were they something more? The repetition of the pattern makes conspiracy theories more plausible. It suggests that intelligence failures are not anomalies, they are features of the system. Part of the answer is the outcome itself. Pearl Harbor did unite the nation. It did enable American entry into the war. It did lead to the defeat of fascism, and in hindsight, it is almost impossible to imagine the Second World War ending the way it did without American involvement. American industrial power produced the ships, aircraft, tanks, and supplies that overwhelmed the Axis. American manpower tipped the balance in Europe and the Pacific. American resources sustained the Allied war effort. Without Pearl Harbor, would the United States have entered the war at all? And if not, what would the world look like today? So even if the attack was not deliberately allowed, it achieved the result that leadership needed. And that makes it hard to separate failure from intent, because the consequences of Pearl Harbor were exactly what Roosevelt had argued was necessary. The nation mobilized, public opinion shifted, the isolationists were silenced, and America became, in Roosevelt's words, the arsenal of democracy. Researchers will continue to debate, new documents will be declassified, new analyses will be published, conferences will be held, books will be written. But a definitive answer may never come, because the question of Pearl Harbor is not really about evidence. It is about trust. Do we trust that leaders tell us the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable? Do we trust that when disasters happen, they happen because of mistakes, not choices? Do we trust that those in power prioritize our safety over strategic goals? These are not questions that documents can answer. They are questions that each person must answer for themselves, based on their understanding of history and their beliefs about human nature. For some, the official narrative is sufficient. Pearl Harbor was a tragedy. It was a failure of communication, coordination, and preparedness. It was a lesson learned. The system was reformed. Safeguards were put in place. It won't happen again. For others, the gaps in the story are too large to ignore. They see a pattern of warnings missed, decisions delayed, and outcomes too convenient. They see documents withheld, investigations limited, and scapegoats chosen, and they conclude that something more was happening beneath the surface. And for all of us, Pearl Harbor remains a reminder of how fragile security can be, and how quickly the world can change. Because that's what Pearl Harbor demonstrated most powerfully. In a matter of hours, everything changed. A nation that had been divided became united. A war that had been distant became immediate. A future that had been uncertain became clear. And once that change happened, there was no going back. The America that existed on December 6th, 1941, was gone forever. The isolationism that had defined American foreign policy for decades was finished. The debate over intervention was over. Pearl Harbor created a new America, one that would emerge from the war as a superpower, with military bases around the world, alliances across continents, and a permanent role in global affairs. That transformation was inevitable once the attack happened. The question is whether someone understood that and made sure the attack happened. Epilogue. The line between failure and choice. Stand at the memorial today, and you can still see the outline of the USS Arizona beneath the water. The white memorial structure spans the sunken hull, reflecting in the calm harbour. Oil still seeps from the ship, slow, dark droplets rising to the surface. They call them the tears of the Arizona, the tears that never stop. More than 2,000 names are inscribed on the walls, Each one represents a life cut short, a family shattered, a future erased. Young men who never got to grow old, who never got to see their children, who never got to live the lives they had planned. Pearl Harbor is remembered as a day of infamy, a surprise attack, a turning point in history. But history is rarely as simple as the monuments we build to commemorate it, because underneath the heroism and the sacrifice and the unity that followed, there is a question that has never been fully answered. Was Pearl Harbor a failure to see the warning signs, or was it a decision to let them unfold? Official history tells us it was the former. The conspiracy theory suggests it was the latter. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Perhaps it was not a deliberate conspiracy, but a series of choices to prioritize some intelligence over others, to delay action, to avoid confrontation, to hope that diplomacy might still work, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. Perhaps it was not malice, but calculation, a riapos, recognition that war was inevitable, and that the question was not whether to fight, but how to enter the fight with the nation behind you. Perhaps the line between failure and choice is thinner than we want to believe. Because in the end, the question is not just about Pearl Harbor. It is about every moment in history when leaders faced impossible decisions. Every time they weighed lives against strategy. Every time they chose silence over transparency. Every time they let events unfold because intervention seemed worse than inaction. And it is about what we, as citizens, demand from those who lead us. Do we demand the truth, even when it is painful? Do we demand accountability, even when it is inconvenient? Do we demand that our safety comes first, even when the cost is high? Or do we accept that sometimes the greater good requires sacrifice, and that those sacrifices are made without our knowledge or consent? These are not easy questions. They are the questions that Pearl Harbor forces us to ask. On December the 7th, 1941, the world changed in a matter of hours. A nation that had been divided became united. A war that had been distant became immediate. A future that had been uncertain became clear. Whether that change was the result of failure or choice, accident or design, is something each person must decide for themselves. But one thing is certain. When history shifts overnight, when the unthinkable becomes real, when the warnings we ignored become the disasters we must face, we cannot help but ask, was it destiny, or was it decision? And if it was decision, whose decision was it? The fires burned for 3 days at Pearl Harbor. The smoke could be seen from miles away. Bodies were pulled from the water and from the wreckage for weeks. Some were never found. The Arizona still holds more than 900 men in her hull. They were never recovered. The ship is their tomb. Every year survivors of Pearl Harbor and, now descendants of survivors, gather at the memorial. They drop flower petals into the water. They remember the friends they lost. They tell their stories to younger generations. And they always ask the same question. Could this have been prevented? The official investigation said no, or at least not without information that commanders did not have. The conspiracy theorists say yes, with information that was deliberately withheld. The truth is probably more complex than either answer suggests, because preventing Pearl Harbor would have required many things to go right. It would have required intelligence agencies to share information effectively. It would have required warnings to be specific and urgent. It would have required field commanders to be given full access to classified materials. It would have required someone in authority to challenge the prevailing assumptions about Japan's capabilities and intentions. All of that was possible, none of it happened. Whether that was failure or choice, incompetence or strategy, is the question that will haunt Pearl Harbor forever. Because the answer matters. If Pearl Harbor was a failure, then we learn lessons about communication, coordination, and vigilance. We reform institutions. We create safeguards. We try to prevent it from happening again. If Pearl Harbor was a choice, then we confront uncomfortable truths about power, sacrifice, and the limits of democracy. We ask whether leaders can be trusted. We question official narratives. We demand transparency. Both answers have consequences, and neither answer brings back the men who died, so we remember them. We memorialize them. We tell their stories, and we ask the question that refuses to die. When a nation is caught off guard, is it because no one saw it coming? Or because someone chose not to look? The oil still rises from the Arizona, the tears still fall, and the question still remains. Thank you for listening. Before we begin, if you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review means the world to us, and if you want, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening, and of course, if you enjoy the content, subscribing really helps us keep bringing you these stories. Now let's get into it. They say power whispers, but in the California redwoods, beneath trees that have stood for centuries, power doesn't need to speak at all. It simply gathers and waits. Part 1. The recording. The camera was hidden in a hollowed-out book. Alex had carried it for 3 miles through the forest, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every snapped twig beneath his boots felt like a gunshot. Every shadow between the towering redwoods seemed to shift and watch. It was mid-July in the year 2000, and Alex Jones had just done something most journalists only fantasized about. He had infiltrated Bohemian Grove. The fence had been easier to climb than expected. No electric wire, no guards with dogs, just chain link and darkness and the smell of California pine heavy in the summer air. He'd studied satellite photos for weeks, memorized the layout, waited until the first night of the encampment when security would be focused inward, not out. The reconnaissance had taken months. Alex had spoken with former employees, kitchen staff who'd signed non-disclosure agreements, maintenance workers who'd seen things they couldn't legally discuss. Each conversation had been careful, coded. One former groundskeeper had drawn a map on a napkin in a diner outside Monterey, then burned it in the ashtray before leaving. Another had simply said, "First Saturday night, after dark, stay in the trees." Now he crouched behind a massive redwood trunk watching. The bark pressed against his back, rough and ancient. Somewhere in the distance an owl, a real one, called out into the night. The sound seemed like a warning. Through the trees he could see firelight, hear voices, low, rhythmic, chanting. The sound rolled through the grove like distant thunder, raising goosebumps along his arms despite the warm night. It wasn't the words that unsettled him. He couldn't make those out yet, but the tone, the unified cadence of dozens of voices speaking as one. He pressed record. The camera captured what most of the world would never see. Dozens of figures in dark robes gathering in a clearing. At the centre stood something that didn't belong in any California forest. A stone owl towering 40 feet high, its blank eyes reflecting the flames below. The owl's face was impassive, carved with an almost Egyptian quality. Ancient, knowing, indifferent to human concerns. The ceremony was called the cremation of care. Alex didn't know that yet. He only knew that some of the most powerful men in America were standing in the darkness, wearing hoods, chanting at a stone idol while something burned in an effigy at its base. The effigy was human-shaped, wrapped in fabric, suspended above the flames by chains. As it burned, the chanting grew louder, His voice echoed across the clearing, amplified, theatrical, speaking in archaic language about casting off the burden of conscience, about freedom from responsibility, about 2 weeks of pure indulgence without guilt. Alex's finger stayed on the record button, even as every instinct screamed at him to run. He filmed for 17 minutes before he heard footsteps behind him. Heavy boots on forest floor, multiple people, moving with purpose. Security had spotted him, or someone had reported movement in the restricted zone. When he finally escaped back over that fence, footage secured, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely drive. His shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool night air. He didn't stop at the motel where he'd been staying. He drove straight through, 5 hours back to the Bay Area, checking his rearview mirror every 30 seconds. The video would be uploaded within days, and the question it raised was simple, haunting, and impossible to fully answer. Why do the world's most powerful men gather in total secrecy to perform rituals in the woods? Part 2, The Beginning. 128 years earlier, in 1872, 5 men sat in a San Francisco tavern and decided to start a club. They were writers, journalists, artists, men who valued culture over commerce, poetry over profit. They called themselves bohemians, wanderers, freethinkers, people who rejected the rigid social structures of Gilded Age America. The founding members were modest in means but ambitious in spirit. Henry Edwards, a journalist for the San Francisco Examiner. James Bowman, a struggling painter whose landscapes never sold. Joseph Redding, a poet whose work appeared in small literary magazines nobody read. They met in cheap taverns, rented rooms above bakeries for meetings, staged plays in borrowed theatres. The Bohemian Club was born from good intentions. Their motto, borrowed from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, was elegant. Weaving spiders come not here. It meant business and politics were forbidden. Only art mattered, only creativity, only the meeting of minds unchained from the pursuit of wealth. For 27 years it stayed that way. The club met in the city. They performed plays, read poetry, debated philosophy. Membership was exclusive but modest. Journalists who couldn't afford lavish lifestyles, painters who worked in cramped studios, musicians who played for passion instead of pay. Annual dues were kept low deliberately, to ensure artists could afford to participate. Then, in 1899, everything changed. The club purchased 2,700 acres of ancient redwood forest north of San Francisco in Sonoma County. The money came from a wealthy patron, an industrialist, named William Crocker, whose father had built the Central Pacific Railroad. Crocker wasn't an artist, he was a banker, but he appreciated culture, or so he said, and he wanted to support the club's vision. They called it Bohemian Grove. The first summer encampment was held that same year. 2 weeks of camping, drinking, performing plays beneath the trees. Members slept in tents, cooked over campfires, staged elaborate theatrical productions on outdoor stages they built themselves. It was supposed to be an escape, a place where creative souls could breathe. But money always follows beauty, and power always follows money. Within 5 years the membership had shifted. Bankers joined, claiming an appreciation for the arts. Railroad executives attended performances and asked to become members. Oil magnates from Southern California heard about the Grove and requested invitations. The artists noticed, of course. They complained in private letters, in journal entries that would be discovered decades later. One founding member wrote, "We built a sanctuary from wealth, and wealth has followed us here. They dress as we do, speak as we do, but they are not us. They are tourists in our world." But the club needed money. Maintaining 2,700 acres of pristine forest wasn't cheap, and the wealthy patrons were generous. They funded new cabins, improved facilities, hired staff to manage the property. All they asked in return was membership, access. The artists told themselves it would be fine, that the motto still mattered, that business and politics would still be banned. They were wrong. Part 3. when the poets left. By 1905, the membership roles had shifted completely. Where there had once been struggling writers, there were now railroad tycoons. Where there had been painters, there were now bankers, industrialists joined, oil magnates, men whose decisions shaped markets, cities, entire regions. The original artists didn't leave immediately. They stayed, watching their club transform around them. Some adapted, finding wealthy patrons among the new members. Others grew bitter, attending less frequently, until they stopped coming altogether. A few died, their obituaries noting their founding membership in the Bohemian Club, a detail that meant less with each passing year. The motto remained the same: "Weaving spiders come not here." But everyone knew it had become a lie. The business deals happened anyway, just quietly. A railroad executive and a mining company owner would take a walk through the forest discussing land rights. A banker and a politician would share drinks by the campfire talking about legislation. No formal contracts were signed at the Grove. That would violate the spirit of the motto. But understandings were reached. Handshakes were exchanged. Partnerships were formed. By the 1920s, the transformation was complete. Herbert Hoover attended regularly, years before becoming president. He was Secretary of Commerce at the time, and the Grove gave him access to the titans of American industry in an informal setting. Decisions that might take months of official meetings in Washington could be sketched out over a weekend in the Redwoods. Dwight Eisenhower was a regular guest in the 40s and 50s. A Supreme Allied commander during World War II, he'd become accustomed to making decisions of global consequence. The Grove offered something different, a place to network with the civilian leadership that controlled defence budgets, manufacturing capacity, political support. Richard Nixon came repeatedly throughout his career. He'd first attended in the late 40s, shortly after being elected to Congress. The Grove was where he made the connections that would carry him to the vice presidency, then the presidency, then ultimately to resignation in disgrace. But even after Watergate, even after his political career had ended, he maintained his membership. Ronald Reagan, George Bush Sr., Henry Kissinger, military leaders, intelligence officials, CEOs of companies that controlled more wealth than most nations. The list reads like a shadow government, and perhaps that's exactly what it was. The Bohemian Grove had evolved. It was no longer a retreat for artists. It was a gathering place for the architects of American power. And what happened there? What was discussed? What was decided? What was agreed upon in hushed conversations between men who shaped policy and war and economy remained locked behind walls of absolute secrecy. Part 4. The Manhattan Project. September 1942. The world was at war. Nazi Germany had swept across Europe, occupying France, bombing London into rubble, pushing deep into Soviet territory. Imperial Japan controlled the Pacific from mainland China to the Philippines. America had been pulled into the conflict less than a year earlier, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, still scrambling to mobilize an economy that had spent the previous decade in depression. That September, during the Bohemian Grove's annual encampment, a meeting occurred that would change human history. Present were some of the most brilliant scientific minds in America. Ernest Lawrence, a physicist who had invented the cyclotron and would win the Nobel Prize. J. Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist from Berkeley who spoke 6 languages and quoted Hindu scripture. Military officials whose names remain partially classified to this day, men who understood strategy and logistics and the brutal mathematics of total war. The meeting happened in a camp called Chowder and Marching Society. It wasn't a public gathering, no stage, no audience, no theatrical performance. Just a dozen men in a cabin talking late into the night. They drank scotch. They smoked cigarettes. They discussed the possibility of building a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. The physics was theoretical but promising. German scientists had discovered nuclear fission in 1938. Jewish physicists fleeing the Nazis had brought that knowledge to America, along with a terrifying certainty. If they could figure out how to weaponize atomic energy, so could Hitler. The question wasn't whether to build the bomb. The question was how quickly it could be done, and whether America could do it before Germany. No official minutes were recorded, no transcripts exist. But historians have confirmed the meeting happened. Lawrence's personal papers mention the Grove gathering. Oppenheimer's biographers reference conversations that took place there. Military records show that key personnel were granted leave to attend the encampment that year, despite wartime restrictions on travel. Shortly afterward, within weeks, the Manhattan Project was formally accelerated. Funding increased exponentially. Personnel expanded from dozens to thousands. Facilities were built in secret locations: Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, Los Alamos, New Mexico. The secret program to develop atomic weapons shifted into high gear. Conspiracy theorists point to this and ask a simple question. Did they plan the atomic bomb at Bohemian Grove? The answer is more complicated than yes or no. They didn't design the bomb there. The physics was developed in labs, the engineering in Los Alamos, the uranium enrichment in massive facilities that required industrial infrastructure. But the decision to move forward, the political will, the strategic coordination between military and scientific leadership, the allocation of resources on a scale never before attempted, may have crystallized in those private conversations beneath the redwoods. Think about what that means. The most consequential weapon in human history, the device that would kill hundreds of thousands at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the technology that would define global politics for the next 80 years. Its development may have been accelerated by conversations held at a private men's club, away from congressional oversight, away from public debate, away from any democratic process. No oversight, no press, no records, just power, talking to power, deciding the fate of the world over whiskey and campfire smoke. Part 5. The Owl. The stone owl stands at the edge of a small lake called Mirror Lake, 40 feet tall, carved from concrete and stone, its wings spread wide, its eyes empty and unblinking. The construction is crude by modern standards. The owl looks less like a majestic bird and more like an ancient idol, something that might be discovered in ruins of a forgotten civilization. At its base is a shrine, an altar where the cremation of care ceremony takes place every summer. The ritual happens on the first Saturday night of the encampment. Members are informed of the time through word of mouth. No printed schedules, no announcements. As sunset approaches, men begin gathering at their camps, changing into robes. Each camp has its own colour: red, black, green, brown. The robes are simple, hooded, monastic. By nightfall, hundreds of robed figures form a procession through the trees. They carry torches, real fire, not electric lights. The procession is silent except for the crunch of footsteps on the forest floor and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. The path winds through the grove for nearly a mile before reaching Mirror Lake. The owl looms above them, lit from below by carefully positioned floodlights that make it appear even larger, more imposing. The lake reflects everything: the owl, the torches, the gathering crowd, creating the illusion of two ceremonies, one above and one below, mirror images in an ancient rite. When the procession is complete, the ceremony begins. It's elaborate, professionally produced. A sound system hidden in the trees broadcasts music, orchestral, dramatic, specifically composed for this ritual. There's narration delivered by a voice that booms across the water with theatrical gravitas. The narration tells a story. Care, the burden of conscience, arrives at the grove seeking to ruin the members' enjoyment. The owl, representing wisdom, representing the ancient knowledge that transcends human morality, rejects care, condemns it, orders it destroyed. Care is represented by a human-shaped effigy, suspended by chains above a pyre at the owl's base. As the narration reaches its climax, the effigy is lowered into the flames. It burns for several minutes while the robed figures watch in silence. The message is clear. For the next 2 weeks, these men are free from the burden of responsibility, free from guilt, free from the weight of their decisions. Care means worry, responsibility, conscience, guilt. The ceremony represents shedding those burdens. Officially, it's described as harmless theatre, a tradition dating back to the early 1920s, created by a member who was a professional theatre director. A way for powerful men to relax and forget the weight of their decisions. Nothing more than elaborate performance art, a bit of pageantry to mark the beginning of the encampment. But symbolism matters. When you tell the world's most influential leaders that they can, symbolically, ritually, burn away their sense of responsibility, what are you really doing? When CEOs who make decisions affecting thousands of employees watch care burn, what message do they receive? When politicians who control military budgets see conscience destroyed by fire, what permission are they being given? When generals who order troops into combat participate in a ritual that explicitly celebrates freedom from moral burden, what does that say about the wars they'll wage? Are you helping them relax? Or are you giving them permission? The owl is Minerva, they say, Roman goddess of wisdom. The ceremony is about wisdom transcending worry, about strategic thinking unencumbered by emotion. But Minerva was also the goddess of warfare, and wisdom without conscience is just calculation. Part 6. Nixon's Tape. August 1971. President Richard Nixon was in the Oval Office speaking with his Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman. The conversation was recorded, as all conversations in Nixon's White House were, captured by the secret taping system that would eventually destroy his presidency. They were discussing the Bohemian Grove. The context is important. Nixon and Haldeman were talking about campaign strategy for the upcoming election. They'd been reviewing potential donors, discussing who to court, who to invite to White House dinners. Someone, the tape doesn't make clear who, had suggested reaching out to Bohemian Grove members. Nixon's response was immediate and visceral. The Bohemian Grove, I won't go into it, but it's the most effing goddamn thing you could ever imagine. The profanity was unusual for Nixon on tape. He cursed occasionally, but this was emphatic, emotional, the kind of language people use when describing something that genuinely disturbed them. He refused to elaborate. The recording cuts to a different topic, something about fundraising in California, details that seemed trivial compared to what had just been said. Whatever Nixon meant, whatever he saw or experienced or understood about the Grove, he never explained publicly. The comment was discovered years later during the Watergate investigation, buried in hours of White House recordings that were being analysed for evidence of obstruction of justice. People still debate what he meant. Was he disgusted by something he witnessed? Nixon had attended the Grove multiple times throughout his political career. He'd participated in the cremation of care ceremony. He'd networked with the members, built the relationships that would carry him to the presidency. But his comment suggested something more than simple distaste for theatre. Was he impressed in a way that troubled him? The phrase, most goddamn thing you could imagine, could mean extraordinary, overwhelming beyond normal experience. Perhaps he'd seen the true extent of the power concentrated in those woods, and it had shaken something in him. Was he horrified? Nixon was many things, calculating, paranoid, ruthless when necessary, but he wasn't immune to moral consideration. The Watergate scandal showed his capacity for wrongdoing, but the tapes also showed a man who sometimes agonized over decisions, who understood the weight of presidential power. Perhaps something at the Grove had crossed a line he didn't want to discuss. Was he amused in a dark way? Nixon had a cynical streak. Maybe he found the whole thing absurd. Powerful men playing dress-up, performing elaborate rituals, taking themselves so seriously. But if it was just silly theatre, why refuse to explain it? The ambiguity is the point. If Bohemian Grove was just a social club, just a place where old men dressed up and performed silly rituals, why did the President of the United States refuse to describe it? What was he protecting? Or what was he afraid to reveal? Haldeman, for his part, never elaborated either. Years later, after serving time for his role in Watergate, he was occasionally asked about the Grove in interviews. He always deflected, changed the subject, or said simply, "It's a private club, members don't discuss it." But the tape remains. Nixon's voice, recorded without his knowledge, preserved for history. A sitting president in the privacy of the Oval Office, describing something he'd personally witnessed as the most goddamn thing you could imagine, and then refusing to explain what that meant. Part 7. The Rules. Bohemian Grove operates under rules so strict they resemble military classification protocols. The official rulebook is short, just a few pages, but every word is enforced absolutely. Violations lead to immediate expulsion. No appeals, no exceptions. Members who've belonged for decades have been banned for single infractions. No press allowed, ever. Not mainstream media, not independent journalists, not documentary filmmakers. No exceptions. Reporters who've attempted to enter have been detained by private security, sometimes turned over to local law enforcement on trespassing charges. The club's lawyers are aggressive about prosecution. No recording devices, cameras, phones, audio equipment, all banned. Members are expected to surrender electronics at entry, or leave them locked in cars. Some camps conduct electronic sweeps to ensure compliance. The prohibition is taken so seriously that even senior members have been expelled for photographing their own camp areas. No wives or female guests. The Grove is exclusively male. Women are not permitted on the grounds during the encampment, with the exception of a handful of staff members who serve meals and clean cabins. Even female family members of members, daughters, mothers, sisters, are prohibited. The only women allowed are those working in service positions. This rule in particular has generated criticism. Why exclude women entirely? The official explanation is tradition, a preservation of the club's original all-male culture. But critics point out that excluding half the population from a space where policy is discussed and power is consolidated effectively excludes women from certain networks of influence. No public statements. What happens at the Grove stays at the Grove. Members who violate this rule face permanent expulsion. The prohibition extends beyond just talking to press. Members are expected not to discuss Grove matters with anyone, including family members. There are stories of wives who never knew their husbands attended, who discovered the membership only after death when dealing with estate paperwork. There are accounts of children who grew up unaware their fathers disappeared for 2 weeks every July, told only that it was a business retreat or camping trip. Staff sign non-disclosure agreements that extend for decades. Even after leaving employment, they are legally bound not to discuss what they've seen or heard. The NDAs include substantial financial penalties for violations, amounts large enough to bankrupt most working-class people. Some former staff have reported receiving legal threats years after leaving, when the club suspected they might be considering talking to journalists. A former kitchen worker interviewed anonymously in the late 90s said, "I worked there for 3 summers. I saw things, heard things, but I signed papers saying I'd never discuss it, and those papers don't expire. Ever. They made that very clear." Conspiracy theorists argue that this level of secrecy exceeds anything necessary for a social club. If it's just theatre, just rich men playing dress-up in the woods, why the ironclad silence? Why the NDAs? Why the absolute prohibition on documentation? The official answer is privacy. Powerful people deserve a place to relax without scrutiny. Public figures, politicians, CEOs, generals, live under constant observation. Every word is analysed, every action is recorded, every decision is debated. The Grove offers freedom from that burden, a place to be human, to make mistakes, to speak without calculation. That answer would be more convincing if the Grove welcomed documentation that could prove its innocence. If rituals are harmless, why not allow filming? If conversations are purely social, why ban note-taking? If nothing illegal or unethical occurs, why threaten legal action against anyone who discusses what happens there? Privacy and secrecy are not the same thing. Privacy protects individuals from unwanted intrusion. Secrecy protects actions from accountability. The Grove's rules are designed for secrecy. Part 8. The Camps. Bohemian Grove is divided into more than 100 smaller camps, each with its own name, character and membership. Mandalay, Hillbillies, Caveman, Stowaway, Isle of Aves, Silverado Squatters, Lost Angels, Owl's Nest. The names range from whimsical to pretentious, but the hierarchy is real. Some camps are more prestigious than others, some are older, more connected to power. Membership in certain camps is a signal of status within the Grove's internal social structure. Mandalay is considered the most elite. Its members have included multiple presidents, defense secretaries, Supreme Court justices. The camp is located in a prime spot within the Grove, close to the lake, surrounded by old-growth redwoods. The cabins are larger, better appointed. When members give lakeside talks, a daily tradition at the Grove, Mandalay members are given prime-speaking slots. Hillbillies is another high-status camp with a membership that leans toward business leaders. CEOs of major corporations, private equity executives, venture capitalists. The camp throws elaborate parties, brings in expensive whiskey, hires musicians to perform. Caveman, despite its primitive name, is equally prestigious. Military leaders, intelligence officials, defense contractors. The camp has a reputation for serious conversations about national security, geopolitics, strategic planning. Lower status camps exist on the periphery of the Grove, housed in smaller cabins, with memberships that include newly inducted members, younger executives still building their careers, academics and artists who provide intellectual credibility but less practical power. Members spend their 2 weeks rotating between camps, attending lakeside talks, watching theatrical performances, drinking heavily, and most importantly, talking. The daily schedule at the Grove is structured but flexible. Mornings begin with breakfast at individual camps. Then members gather at the lakeside for talks, informal presentations on various topics, given by members or invited guests. Topics range from politics to technology to philosophy. Past speakers have included sitting presidents, Nobel Prize winners, top scientists. Afternoons are for socializing. Members wander between camps, join impromptu discussions, take walks through the forest. This is when the real networking happens. CEOs sit beside generals on fallen logs, discussing defense contracts. Politicians share drinks with intelligence officials, talking about foreign policy. Corporate executives have breakfast with Supreme Court justices, mentioning cases that might affect their businesses. Evenings bring theatrical performances on the Grove's outdoor stages. Productions are elaborate, professionally designed, performed by members who've rehearsed for months. Some are comedies, some are dramas, some are musical revues. The quality varies, but the attendance is mandatory, a way to ensure all members gather together at least once daily. Late nights are for drinking and deeper conversations. This is when guards are lowered, when the formal structure dissolves, when friendships are cemented and alliances are formed. There are no aides present, no assistants, no one taking notes, no transcripts, no oversight, just conversation. And here's where conspiracy theories find their footing. In 1953, shortly after a Bohemian Grove encampment, the CIA launched Operation Ajax, overthrowing the democratically elected government of Iran and installing the Shah. Multiple attendees of that summer's Grove gathering were directly involved in planning the coup. Allen Dulles, CIA director, Kermit Roosevelt, the CIA officer who ran the operation on the ground, executives from oil companies that would benefit enormously from Iranian oil concessions. Coincidence? The official story is that Operation Ajax was planned in CIA headquarters, approved through proper channels, executed by trained operatives, and that's true. But the will to proceed, the decision that regime change was acceptable, that democracy could be sacrificed for strategic interests, may have been reinforced by conversations at the Grove. In 1967, energy policy discussions at the Grove preceded major shifts in American oil strategy. Executives from companies that profited enormously from those shifts were present. Within months, federal regulations changed, opening new areas for drilling, reducing environmental restrictions, providing tax benefits for oil production. Coincidence? Policy doesn't change in a vacuum. Someone has to advocate for it, someone has to convince legislators, someone has to coordinate between industry and government. The Grove provided a space for those conversations to happen informally, away from congressional hearings, away from public scrutiny. In 1989, defence contractors who attended the Grove saw their contracts renewed and expanded under the next administration. Many of those contractors had been camping alongside future cabinet members, sharing drinks, discussing the importance of military readiness, arguing for increased defence spending. Coincidence? In 2001, weeks after that Summers Grove encampment, the September 11th attacks occurred. The response, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the expansion of surveillance powers, the increase in defence and intelligence budgets, benefited many Grove members. Was the specific attack foreseeable? No. But the broader policy framework that enabled the response, the prioritisation of security over liberty, the willingness to wage preemptive war, had been discussed at the Grove for years. Coincidence? No one can prove coordination. But the proximity, the casual, unrecorded mingling of people who later make decisions that align perfectly, raises questions that are impossible to dismiss entirely. Part 9. The Infiltrators. Alex Jones wasn't the first person to try to expose Bohemian Grove. He was just the first to bring back video. Before him, journalists had attempted to breach the perimeter. Most were caught, detained, and escorted off the property with threats of legal action. A few managed to observe from a distance but saw nothing conclusive. The Grove security was professional, experienced, thorough. In 1989, a team of activists from San Francisco attempted a coordinated infiltration. They planned for months, studying the layout, timing their approach for maximum confusion during the opening ceremony. 3 people made it over the fence. All 3 were caught within 30 minutes, detained in a security building, then handed over to local law enforcement on trespassing charges. They spent the night in jail. The charges were eventually dropped, but the message was clear. The Grove was protected. In the mid-90s, a freelance journalist named Rick posed as a service worker. He managed to get hired on kitchen staff, passed the background check, signed the NDA. He worked for 4 days before someone recognised him from a previous article he'd written about elite clubs. He was escorted off property immediately, threatened with a lawsuit for fraud and breach of contract. The lawsuit never materialised. The club likely didn't want the publicity, but Rick's notes and recordings were confiscated. In 2000, Alex Jones succeeded because he was brazen. He didn't sneak in like a spy. He walked in like he belonged. He studied how members moved, how they dressed, what they carried. On the night of the cremation of care ceremony, he simply walked through an entrance gate during a shift change, moving with purpose, looking like he had every right to be there. Security at the Grove follows a simple principle. People who belong act like they belong. They don't hesitate, don't look around nervously, don't question their right to access. Jones understood this. He wore dark clothing that could pass for staff uniform in dim light. He carried the hollowed-out book casually, like it was a notebook or prop for the ceremony. He moved toward the gathering crowd with confidence. Once in the crowd, he was invisible. Hundreds of robed figures, all anonymous, all focused on the ceremony. He positioned himself at the edge, behind a massive redwood trunk, and filmed for 17 minutes. The footage he captured showed exactly what Grove officials had always described: a theatrical ritual performed in robes, involving a stone owl and a symbolic burning. No human sacrifice, no occult summoning, no illegal activity, just theatre. But the image was undeniably strange. Powerful men in robes, chanting in unison, watching an effigy burn while a voice boomed about destroying care and conscience. The footage went viral when Jones released it, spawning countless conspiracy theories, documentaries, YouTube videos, and the fact that it was kept so secret, despite being just theatre, made people wonder what else might be hidden. British journalist Jon Ronson also infiltrated the Grove around the same time. He was researching a book about extremists and conspiracy theorists, and he wanted to see the Grove for himself. He attended as a guest of a member, not a full infiltration, but still a rare glimpse inside. His account, published in Them, Adventures with Extremists, was more measured than Jones's. He confirmed the rituals are real, the secrecy is absolute, and the membership includes some of the most powerful people in the world. But he also noted the strange disconnect between the ceremony's dramatic presentation and the casual atmosphere afterward. Members treated it like any other theatre performance, applauding at the end, then heading back to their camps for drinks. Ronson wrote, "The cremation of care is the most bizarre piece of theatre I've ever witnessed. But what struck me wasn't the ritual itself. It was how normal the participants found it. They'd been doing this for decades. It was tradition. And tradition, no matter how strange, becomes invisible to those who practice it." What neither infiltration could reveal was the content of private conversations. What was said in the cabins? What was discussed during late-night walks through the forest? What agreements, explicit or implicit, were reached over drinks and campfires? That remains unknown. And perhaps that's the point. The Grove doesn't hide its rituals because the rituals are sinister. It hides its conversations because the conversations are powerful. The cremation of care is theatre. Strange theatre, symbolic theatre, theatre that reinforces a particular worldview, but theatre nonetheless. The real secret is what happens after the ceremony ends. Part 10. The Conspiracy. Let's be clear about what Bohemian Grove is not. It is not a site of human sacrifice. No credible evidence supports this. The rituals involve effigies, not people. Claims of ritual murder based on misinterpretation, deliberate misrepresentation, or outright fabrication. It is not a centre of occult magic. The owl symbolises Minerva, Roman goddess of wisdom. The ceremony is theatrical, not supernatural. There are no spells being cast, no demons being summoned, no supernatural forces being invoked. The participants are powerful, but they're not wizards. It is not illegal. Everything that happens at the Grove, so far as we know, is protected by privacy rights and freedom of association. Wealthy people are allowed to form private clubs. They're allowed to perform strange rituals. They're allowed to network with each other. None of that violates any law. But here's what it might be. A coordination space. A place where people who control industries, governments and militaries can speak freely, without record, without oversight, and without the constraints of public accountability. Think about how policy normally works in a democracy. Proposed legislation is debated publicly. Congressional hearings are held. Interest groups lobby openly. The press covers developments. Citizens can track how their representatives vote, can pressure them, can vote them out if they disagree with their decisions. But what happens when the people making policy, or influencing those who make policy, can meet privately to coordinate positions before any public process begins? What happens when a CEO and a senator can agree on environmental regulations before any bill is introduced, ensuring the final legislation will benefit the CEO's company? What happens when a general and a defense contractor can discuss weapon systems before any Pentagon procurement process begins, ensuring the contractor's bid will be favoured? What happens when industry executives can brief politicians on their preferred policies, provide talking points, coordinate strategies, all before any congressional debate occurs? That's not illegal. But it subverts the democratic process. It creates a shadow channel where decisions are shaped before the public even knows there's a decision to be made. The Grove provides that channel, a bonding mechanism. Shared rituals create loyalty. When you've stood beside someone in a robe, chanting at an owl statue, you've shared something strange and intimate. That creates trust. That creates obligation. Psychological research on group bonding is clear. Shared experiences, especially unusual or emotionally significant experiences, create strong social ties. Military units use shared hardship to build cohesion. Fraternities use initiation rituals to create loyalty. Religious communities use ceremonies to reinforce belonging. The Bohemian Grove's rituals serve the same function. When a CEO and a politician participate in the cremation of care together, they're not just watching theatre. They're engaging in a shared ritual that marks them as part of the same tribe. They're members of the same exclusive club. They've participated in the same strange ceremony. That creates a bond that transcends professional relationships. And bonds create obligations. If you're a senator and you need to make a decision that will affect a company, and the CEO of that company is a fellow Grove member who stood beside you at the cremation of care, that relationship affects your thinking. Not overtly, not through explicit corruption, but through the subtle influence of social connection, a pressure release valve. The cremation of care isn't just symbolic fun, it's a psychological tool. It tells participants they can temporarily shed moral weight, and if you're making decisions that affect millions of lives, that kind of psychological permission might be useful. Consider what these men do in their normal lives. CEOs make decisions that result in layoffs, that prioritise shareholders over workers, that externalise environmental costs onto communities. Politicians make decisions that send soldiers to war, that cut social programmes to reduce deficits, that protect certain industries while others struggle. Generals make decisions that result in deaths, enemy deaths, civilian deaths, sometimes the deaths of their own troops. Those decisions have moral weight. Human psychology requires us to either justify those decisions or carry guilt about them. The cremation of care offers a third option: ritualise permission to stop caring, even temporarily, even symbolically. It's not that Grove members are cartoonishly evil, cackling as they burn effigies and plot world domination. It's that they've created a space where moral consideration can be set aside, where strategic thinking can proceed without the burden of conscience, where decisions can be made purely on the basis of power and benefit. None of this is provable, but correlation is compelling. When the same people who attend Bohemian Grove later shape policy, wage wars, shift economies, and redefine global power structures, and when those decisions consistently benefit the same small circle of attendees, questions are inevitable. The conspiracy isn't that they're worshipping Satan or performing dark magic. The conspiracy is that they've created a space where power can coordinate without accountability, where relationships can be built that transcend democratic oversight, where decisions can be shaped before the public even knows there's a decision to be made. That's subtle, that's sophisticated, that's far more disturbing than any ritual. Part 11. The present. Bohemian Grove still meets every summer. 2 weeks in July. Same location, same rituals, same secrecy. The encampment now occurs in the age of social media, satellite imagery, and ubiquitous surveillance technology. Yet somehow it remains largely hidden. The Grove has adapted its security to modern threats. Cell phone jammers are rumoured to be in use during sensitive gatherings. Drone detection systems protect against aerial photography. Digital surveillance of employees and members has intensified. Membership remains exclusive. Waiting lists stretch for years. Entry requires wealth, influence, or both. The initiation fee alone is tens of thousands of dollars, with annual dues to match. For most Americans, that cost is prohibitive. For the members, it's trivial. The demographics have shifted slightly over recent decades. While still overwhelmingly white and exclusively male, the Grove has admitted more tech CEOs, more international business leaders, more financiers from the globalized economy. The old guard, industrialists and politicians, share the camps with newer power brokers, venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, tech entrepreneurs. But the core purpose remains unchanged. Modern technology has made secrecy harder. Satellite imagery shows the layout. Anyone with Google Earth can see the camps, the stages, even the owl statue. Leaked membership lists circulate online, though the Grove denies their accuracy. Former staff occasionally break their NDAs and share fragments of stories, usually anonymously, usually with little concrete detail. But the core remains locked. No one outside the Grove knows what is said there. No one knows what deals are discussed. No one knows what coordination happens between the people who control the levers of power. In 2008, during the encampment, the financial crisis was already building. Members that summer included executives from banks that would soon fail, regulators who would be tasked with managing the collapse, politicians who would vote on bailout packages, What was discussed? What preparations were made? What understandings were reached about how the crisis would be managed? We don't know. In 2016, during the encampment, the presidential campaign was reaching its climax. Members included political operatives, major donors, media executives who would cover the race. What was discussed? What strategies were coordinated? What narratives were agreed upon? We don't know. In 2020, the encampment was cancelled due to the pandemic. For the first time in over a century, the Grove didn't meet. But in 2021, it resumed. Members included pharmaceutical executives, public health officials, politicians dealing with pandemic response. What was discussed about vaccine policy, about mandates, about the balance between public health and economic concerns? We don't know. And that's the real conspiracy. Not devil worship, not occult magic, not human sacrifice. Just power, gathering in private, away from scrutiny, talking without record. Epilogue. The question. Here's what we know for certain. Bohemian Grove exists. This isn't speculation or conspiracy theory. It's a registered private club with a physical address, property deeds, tax records. The world's most powerful men meet there every summer. Membership lists, partial, sometimes outdated but largely accurate, have been leaked over the years. They confirm the presence of presidents, cabinet members, Supreme Court justices, generals, intelligence directors, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. They perform rituals involving a stone owl and symbolic burning. Alex Jones's footage confirmed this. Jon Ronson's account confirmed this. Even the Grove's official materials acknowledge the cremation of care ceremony. They enforce absolute secrecy. The rules are documented, the NDAs are real. The security is professional and serious. They have done this for over a century. Bohemian Grove's annual encampments began in 1899 and have continued with only rare interruptions ever since. Major historical events, the Manhattan Project, political coups, economic shifts, wars, have followed closely after Grove gatherings, involving people who attended those gatherings. The correlations are documented in historical records, biographies, declassified documents. Here's what we don't know. What they talk about. No recordings exist, no transcripts, no leaked documents describing specific conversations. What they decide. Do explicit agreements get made? Or is it all just informal networking? We don't know. What they coordinate. Are strategies developed at the Grove later implemented in policy? Or are the connections purely social? We don't know. Whether any of it is illegal. Nothing we know about the Grove involves criminal activity. But legality and ethics aren't the same thing. Whether any of it should concern us. Is this just how power works in any society? Or is it a subversion of democratic principles? Reasonable people disagree. So the question isn't really, what happens at Bohemian Grove? The question is, why does the world's leadership need a place where no records exist? Think about that for a moment. These are people who run countries, corporations, militaries. Their decisions affect billions of people. Their policies shape economies, determine which nations prosper and which struggle, influence whether wars are fought or peace is maintained. Shouldn't those decisions be made transparently? Shouldn't the conversations that lead to those decisions be documented? Shouldn't the public have some window into how power is exercised on their behalf? The Grove's defenders argue that powerful people deserve privacy, that they need a space to speak freely without every word being analysed, that informal relationships and frank conversations are necessary for effective leadership. And there's truth in that, but there's also danger in it, because power without accountability tends toward abuse. Not always, not necessarily, but the tendency is there. Human psychology is clear on this. People in positions of power, insulated from consequences, gradually come to see their own interests and the public interest as identical. The Grove provides that insulation. It creates a space where the powerful can meet without oversight, can form relationships without transparency, can coordinate without accountability. Is it harmless networking? Is it strategic coordination? Or is it a reminder that real power operates best in the shadows, where questions can't be asked, where deals can't be documented, and where the people making decisions that shape our world never have to explain themselves? You decide, because the Grove isn't going anywhere, and neither are the secrets it keeps. Every July they gather, beneath the redwoods, around the owl, away from the world, and we're left outside watching shadows, asking questions, piecing together fragments of truth. Maybe that's exactly how they want it.